The rain had not stopped in 6 days, and Second Lieutenant Erwin Faust had stopped noticing it somewhere around day 4. It ran down the back of his collar in a cold, steady thread, pooled in the duckboards under his boots, dripped off the brim of his helmet in a rhythm he'd started counting without meaning to. Counting things was what you did on the Rhine when there was nothing else to do but wait to die. He'd counted 412 drops off his helmet brim before the earth screamed. That was the only word for it. Not an explosion. Faust had heard explosions, had learned to read them the way a sailor reads weather. This one's a shell. This one's a mine. This one's outgoing, not incoming. Don't flinch. This was something underneath the sound of an explosion. A tearing, wet and vast, like the whole Rhine Valley had an artery, and something had just opened it. The trench wall 40 meters east buckled inward. Not from a shell impact. There was no crater, no scorch, no shrapnel scream. The earth simply folded, sagged, and then didn't stop sagging, revealing a crack of light that had no business existing under 6 days of unbroken cloud cover. It was red, not fire red, not the orange of a shell burst or the white of a mage's ignition formula, a deep, wet, arterial red, pulsing very slightly, like something breathing. Faust. That was Corporal Hess, 3 meters down the trench, rifle already up, though there was nothing yet to point it at. Faust. What in God's name is that? I don't know. He didn't. He was 22 years old and had been on the Rhine Front for 5 months, and he had learned, in that time, that not knowing was the normal condition of a soldier's life, and that the correct response to not knowing was to report it up the chain and let men with more stars figure out whether it was worth dying over. He kept his voice level with the effort that took. Runner. Get to the Kampfgruppe command post. Tell them the Eastern Support Trench has... He didn't have a word for it. Tell them something's opened up. Tell them to send a mage. The private who'd been crouched beside him was already moving, splashing away down the duckboards toward the rear, and Faust turned back toward the light, in time to see the first thing come out of it. It did not crawl. It did not stagger like a wounded man. It stepped out of the tear in the earth the way a soldier steps off a train platform, unhurried, deliberate, its weight settling onto churned Rhine mud like it belonged there, man-shaped more or less. Gray metal, matte and scarred, the color of a rifle barrel left out in weather for years. No face, only a single lens set where a face's eyes should be, a dull point of light that didn't blink because it had nothing to blink with. A slot in its chest, empty, like a wound waiting to be filled. It carried nothing in its hands yet. Its hands hung loose at its sides, but Faust had spent 5 months learning to read a man's stance before he moved, and something in him, some old animal part that had kept him alive this long, understood immediately that this thing did not need to draw a weapon to become one. Fire, Hesse said, and didn't wait for Faust to give the order. His rifle cracked. The round hit the gray figure square in the chest. Faust saw the spark of impact, saw the thing's shoulder rock back half an inch, and then the figure's arm came up, faster than anything built should move, and there was a shape in its hand that hadn't been there a half-second before, a heavy revolver of black iron, and it did not aim so much as it simply pointed, and Hesse's head came apart. There was no time to process it as horror. There was only time to duck, and Faust did, throwing himself flat into the trench mud as 3 more shots cracked out in quick succession, each one finding a man. Private Adler, who'd been at the ammunition crates. Sergeant Oswin, who'd been calling for the field telephone. The trench, which had held 11 living men 90 seconds ago, held 6, and the 6 who remained had gone very, very quiet. The particular silence of soldiers realizing that the war they had trained for was not the war currently trying to kill them. More things were coming through the tier now. Smaller ones, hunched and jerking, pale gray husks with something wet and red leaking from the seams of what might once have been joints, moving in short, erratic bursts, like a film strip skipping frames. And behind them, low and wheeled, something that hissed, a squat, rust-bellied machine dragging a hose nozzle where a mouth should be, and Faust understood with the flat, uncomplicated certainty of a man out of options that if that hissing thing got close enough to use whatever it was built to use, the trench and everyone left in it would burn. "Fall back to the second line," he heard himself say. His voice sounded very far away. Fall back now. They didn't all make it. He counted that too, later, when there was time to count things again. 3 men made the second trench line with him, out of 11 who'd held the position that morning. But in the moment, there was only the mud sucking at his boots, the wet crack of the revolver behind him, and once, terribly, the sound of Private Kessler screaming as one of the hunched gray things caught his ankle and did not let go. 6 kilometers to the rear, in a requisitioned farmhouse serving as forward headquarters for the 203rd's parent Kampfgruppe, Major Tanya von Degurechaff was reading a supply requisition and finding it insufficiently infuriating to be worth the paper it was written on, when the field telephone rang, with a particular shrillness that meant something had gone badly wrong somewhere along the line. She let Serebryakov answer it. That was, after all, what adjutants were for, and Tanya had long ago made peace with the fact that a rational actor delegated communications overhead whenever possible, freeing herself for higher-value cognitive tasks, such as, at this exact moment, calculating whether the battalion's mana reserve reports had been deliberately padded by the supply officer or merely incompetently transcribed. "Major," Serebryakov's voice had changed. Tanya had spent enough months listening to her adjutant field routine reports to have calibrated, with some precision, the acoustic signature of Serebryakov's voice, under varying degrees of alarm, and this was not the register of an artillery barrage, or even a Republic breakthrough. This was something new. "Major, it's the Eastern Support Line, 2nd Lieutenant Faust's position. He says, 'Major, I don't understand what he's saying.'" Tanya set down the requisition form with the flat, economical motion of someone who had learned, through hard experience, that the universe reliably produced new problems the instant she attempted to address old ones, and that resenting this pattern was a waste of the very finite cognitive resources she had available for actually solving anything. "Put it through." The voice on the line was young, and trying very hard not to sound like it was falling apart and failing. Faust reported what he had seen: the tear in the earth, the red light, the gray man-shaped thing that had put down 2 soldiers with 2 shots and not slowed its pace, the small hunched things, the wheeled machine that hissed. He reported it in the flat, over-precise language of a man clinging to procedure, because procedure was the only handhold left, and Tanya listened to all of it without interrupting, because interrupting a panicking junior officer rarely improved the information yield, and she required accurate information considerably more than she required Faust to feel reassured. "Casualties," she said, when he'd finished. 7 confirmed, Major. Possibly more. We didn't have time to." His voice caught. "The revolver, Major. It killed Hesse and Adler and Oswin with 3 shots. It didn't miss once." Tanya set the receiver down against her shoulder for a moment and looked, not at Serebryakov, but at the middle distance, running the numbers the way she ran every problem the war put in front of her. Inputs, constraints, probable outcomes, expected value. 100% hit rate at combat range with a sidearm was not a claim she'd expect from a panicking lieutenant unless it happened to be true, because panicking lieutenants tended to overestimate enemy numbers and underestimate enemy accuracy, not the reverse. 7 dead from an unknown force in under 2 minutes. No artillery preparation. No visible mage signature reported. That was not Republic doctrine. That was not any doctrine she recognized. "Understood, Lieutenant," she said into the receiver, her voice perfectly level. "Hold the second line. Do not advance to retake the position. I am dispatching support." She hung up before he could answer, which was efficient, and turned to find Weiss and Grants already in the doorway. The advantage of a farmhouse command post with thin walls was that useful information traveled fast, with the particular alertness of men who had heard enough of a phone call to know they were about to be put to work. "Sound is out," Tanya said. "New hostile contact. Eastern support trench. Unknown origin. Capability profile inconsistent with known Republic assets. I want a flight the moment Degurechaff and Grants are geared. Weiss, with me." She was already reaching for her orb, the familiar weight of the dual-core Type 95 settling against her palm with the small, precise satisfaction of a well-maintained tool doing exactly what it was built to do. "Whatever this is, I intend to observe it from an altitude that does not require me to personally test the accuracy claims of a 100% hit rate revolver." It was, she reflected, sound tactical thinking, and also, though she would not have phrased it this way even to herself, the closest thing to fear she'd let herself feel in months, a small cold prickle at the base of her skull that some deeply buried part of her recognized as significant before the rest of her had finished processing why. The flight out took 11 minutes, low over churned farmland and the skeletal remains of a village that had changed hands 4 times since spring, and Tanya spent every one of them running threat models that kept collapsing for lack of data. A weapon that never missed suggested either an aiming formula of considerable sophistication or a targeting method entirely outside standard mage combat doctrine. A red rift with no associated mana signature. She'd checked, reflexively, the moment Degurechaff relayed the coordinates, and her own orb registered nothing. No resonance, no distortion, nothing at all, which was in its own way more unsettling than if it had screened with hostile mana, suggested a phenomenon that either predated the Empire's understanding of interdimensional mechanics, or simply operated on principles that understanding didn't apply to. She did not enjoy problems without data. Data was the substrate rational decision-making required, and its absence here felt less like a gap to be filled, and more like a warning that the entire framework she used to model threats might not apply to whatever she was about to see. She saw it before she heard it, which was itself unusual. Combat at this stage of the war was rarely silent, and what she saw, from 400 meters up with Weiss holding formation off her left wing and Degurechaff and Grants trailing in overwatch, was a section of Imperial trench that had simply stopped being a fight and become something closer to a slaughter pen. Bodies in the mud, more than Faust's report had suggested, and moving among them, unhurried, methodical, a scattering of gray and pale figures that did not run, did not take cover, did not do any of the things a rational combatant did when facing potential aerial mage support. They simply kept doing what they were doing. One of the man-shaped gray figures, the one with the revolver, she assumed, though at this distance she couldn't confirm the weapon, was crouched over a fallen soldier's body, and it took her a full second of watching to understand. With a species of clinical revulsion she rarely let herself indulge, that it was not looting the corpse. It was doing something to it, something that made the shape of the body change, collapse inward at the chest, the way a sponge changes shape when you wring it dry. Blood. It was taking the blood. She filed the observation without letting herself dwell on its implications, because dwelling was a luxury she couldn't afford at 400 meters over an active hostile position, and instead began the calculation that actually mattered. Engage now from altitude with a wide radius explosion formula, or descend for a closer assessment first, and risk entering the effective range of a weapon with a reported 100% hit rate. The decision was taken out of her hands. The gray figure at the corpse straightened, unhurried, still, Nothing about it suggested haste was a concept it recognized, and its head, or the lens socket that served as one, tilted upward, directly toward her position, 400 meters up, in weather that should have made a human eye's ability to track a small aerial target at that range essentially impossible. It had no eye, it had a lens, and the lens found her instantly, and held. "Major," Weiss's voice, tight over the formation channel. "It's looking right at you." "I see that, Lieutenant." She kept her tone flat, because panic was a communicable disease, and she was not going to be the one who spread it through her flight. But some very old, very unphilosophical part of her, the part that had crossed over into this body, and this war with nothing but the conviction that survival was the only value worth optimizing for, registered, in that half-second of being seen by something that should not have been able to see her, a fact that mattered more than any threat model she'd built on the flight out. Whatever this was, it did not fight like something that expected to lose. She brought her orb up, mana beginning to spool through the dual cores in the familiar rising hum that had carried her through every battlefield since Norden, and gave the order that would prove, in ways she could not yet calculate, to be the first shot fired in a war within the war. Explosion formula, wide radius, my mark. Weiss, Degurechaff, Grants, converge and engage. Let's find out what we're dealing with. 400 meters below, V1 lowered its gaze from the sky, and for the first time since stepping out of the rift, reached for something other than the revolver. The explosion formula hit the ground 8 meters from where V1 had been standing, and for a fraction of a second, Tanya allowed herself the small, familiar satisfaction of a well-placed strike. Mana bloomed white-orange against the mud, throwing a column of churned earth and shattered duckboard 40 feet into the rain, and the two hunched gray husks nearest the blast simply ceased to exist as coherent shapes, scattered into wet component parts across the crater's lip. V1 was not among them. It had moved, not fled, moved, a distinction Tanya registered with the cold part of her mind that never stopped cataloging. Sidestepping the blast radius with an economy of motion that suggested either extraordinary reflexes or extraordinary foreknowledge of where the formula would land, and in the same motion the revolver in its hand had already found her. The first shot missed by inches, close enough that she felt the report of it more than heard it, a physical pressure against her cheek as she banked hard right on reflex alone. The second shot didn't miss Grants. He was 30 meters to her left, mid-formula, mana still spooling in his orb, when the round took him through the shoulder and spun him out of formation, screaming, trailing a thin, bright arc of blood through the rain. "Grants is hit," Degurechaff's voice, sharp with an alarm that hadn't yet tipped into panic, and Tanya heard her adjutant break formation to cover him, which was correct, which was the procedure, and which left Tanya and Weiss alone against whatever this thing actually was. Weiss, high cover, suppress with kinetic rounds, do not close to melee range. She was already climbing, buying altitude and distance in the same motion, running the numbers again with data that had just gotten considerably more expensive to acquire. 100% hit rate at combat range, confirmed. A capacity to anticipate and evade an area denial formula, confirmed. No visible mana signature from the target itself, still confirmed. She'd have felt an orb spooling up, would have felt something, and there was nothing, which meant whatever let it move like that wasn't drawing on any resource her instruments or her instincts were built to detect. Below, V1 had already reloaded. She caught the motion at the edge of her attention, mechanical and unhurried, 6 rounds seated into the cylinder in under a second, and its lens tracked upward again, finding her through 400 meters of rain and mana haze with the same uncanny certainty as before. She did not wait to find out if the third shot would land. She dropped altitude in a hard diagonal cut, closing distance rather than opening it, because the one advantage she had over a marksman with perfect accuracy was that a moving target inside minimum engagement range was harder to track than one holding steady at 400 meters, and through a tight radius explosion formula, not at V1's position, but at the ground 18 inches ahead of where her read on its gate suggested it would step next. It worked. Barely. The blast caught V1's leading foot and threw it sideways into the crater wall, and for the first time, Tanya saw something that might have been damage, a long, bright gouge torn across the gray plating of its shoulder, wet and dark at the edges, in a way that looked disturbingly like a wound rather than scorched metal. It did not scream. It did not stagger the way a wounded man staggered. It simply reoriented, planted itself, and the revolver came up again before she'd finished her own bank away. The third shot took her across the outer edge of her left wing formation, a graze more than a hit, but it spun her hard enough that she lost 4 meters of altitude fighting to stabilize, and in that half-second of instability, she understood something that the cold, calculating part of her mind filed away with the particular weight reserved for facts that would reorganize every future decision. This thing was not simply dangerous. It was learning her movement pattern in real time, adjusting lead and timing between shots 1 and 3, in a way that suggested either combat experience on a scale she couldn't estimate, or a targeting system that didn't need experience because it processed faster than she could react. Being X, she thought, with the particular bitterness she reserved for moments of genuine crisis. If this is your idea of a joke, I would like it registered that I am not laughing. There was no answer. There rarely was, when she actually wanted one. Major, fall back to regroup. Vice, from above and behind, his own kinetic rounds hammering into the crater to keep V1's attention divided. Grants is down. We need to consolidate. He was right, and she hated that he was right, because retreat was not a maneuver. Tanya von Degurechaff enjoyed executing against an enemy she hadn't yet managed to categorize. But rational actors adjusted plans when the data contradicted the plan, and the data here was unambiguous. This was not a fight she could win through a single aggressive engagement, not without better information than 400 meters of rain and 1 exchange of fire had given her. Withdrawing, she said, and meant it as an order to herself as much as to Weiss, and banked hard for the rear lines, mana burning through her core, at a rate that would have alarmed her if she'd had spare attention to spend on alarm. Below, V1 watched her go. It did not pursue. It lowered the revolver, and for a long moment simply stood in the crater it had been thrown into, rain running down gray plating that was already, faintly, beginning to knit closed along the wound Tanya's formula had opened, not healing exactly, not in any way flesh-healed, but closing, the wet dark edges of the gouge drawing inward, as if something in the blood it had already taken was being spent to repair the damage. It had learned something too, filed it away in whatever passed for memory in a thing built from gunmetal and a coin-shaped absence where a heart should be. The small, flying things that had come to investigate the rift carried mana, the source of the wound, the source of the light that had thrown it sideways, and mana, it now understood with the flat, uncomplicated certainty that was the entire architecture of its being, was not blood, and could not be taken, and could not be spent. Only conventional violence had actually hurt it. The light formulas were dangerous. Nothing else about them mattered. It turned from the crater, revolver already vanishing back into whatever non-space it drew from, and looked instead toward the rift, still pulsing behind it, where more shapes were beginning to emerge into the rain, the low hissing bulk of a street cleaner. 3 more soldiers falling into loose formation without any visible signal passing between them, and behind all of it, still distant, still submerged, something that made the ground itself shudder faintly with each fractional movement, as if whatever was coming next measured its steps in meters rather than centimeters. V1 did not wait for it. It began walking west, toward the sound of the retreating aerial mages, unhurried, patient, entirely certain that the war it had just been dropped into contained an effectively infinite supply of exactly what it needed. The farmhouse command post, 40 minutes later, had the particular controlled chaos of a headquarters that had just been handed a problem no doctrine covered. Grants was on a field cot in the next room, unconscious from blood loss and morphine, a medic's hands still dark to the wrist from closing the wound in his shoulder. Serebryakov stood near the door with the flat, contained expression of someone holding herself together through sheer discipline. Weiss was cleaning mud and something darker off his flight gear, with the mechanical thoroughness of a man who needed his hands occupied. And Tanya stood over the farmhouse's requisitioned map table, staring at a red pin marking the rift's location, running numbers that kept refusing to resolve into anything she could report up the chain with confidence. Casualty report, she said, because reports were solid ground, and she needed solid ground under her at the moment. 11 confirmed dead at the trench position, Serebryakov said. Grants wounded but stable. No confirmed kills on our side. The explosion formulas destroyed 2 of the small ones, but the primary hostile, the one with the revolver, sustained damage and is still mobile. She hesitated, and Tanya heard the hesitation, filed it, waited. Major, I watched it through the engagement. When your formula wounded it, the wound was closing. While we watched, it wasn't healing like a mage heals. It was feeding, somehow, on the ones it killed at the trench. I saw the same thing, Tanya said. It was taking blood from the corpses before we arrived. I want that fact flagged as priority in every report that goes up from this post, because if I'm reading it correctly, it means this war has just acquired an enemy whose logistics improve the more people die, on either side of the front. She let that sit in the room for a moment, watching it land on Weiss's face, on Serebryakov's, watching the 2 of them do the same arithmetic she'd already finished. It means the single worst possible strategic environment for us to be fighting this thing in is a total war that produces tens of thousands of corpses a month, which is, of course, the exact war we are currently fighting. Being X's idea of a joke, Weiss muttered, not quite quietly enough, and Tanya did not correct him, because for once she did not entirely disagree with the sentiment, even if she'd never admit that out loud to anyone who might report it as insubordination toward the divine. The field telephone rang again, and this time it was General Staff. She recognized the exchange code before Serebryakov had even finished answering, and Tanya crossed the room to take the receiver herself, because whatever was on the other end of this line was about to become the single most important conversation of her week, possibly her war. Major von Degurechaff. The voice was Zetur's, dry and precise even through the crackle of field telephony, and underneath the dryness, she could hear something she rarely heard from him. Genuine, unhedged uncertainty. I have 3 contradictory reports on my desk, describing an event on the eastern Rhine sector that none of my analysts can reconcile with any known Republic capability, any known artifact-class threat, or any precedent in Imperial military history. I understand you have direct engagement experience with whatever this is. I do, sir. She kept her voice level, professional, and began, with the same economy she brought to every briefing, to lay out what she'd observed. The rift, the red light with no mana signature, the man-shaped weapon that never missed and healed by consuming the dead, the smaller hostiles emerging behind it, and the detail she suspected would matter most to a general staff currently mid-campaign against the Republic and stretched thin across a continent-spanning front. Sir, I want to be direct about the strategic implication before General von Rudersdorf convenes anything larger. If this hostile force's logistics are tied to battlefield casualties as I believe them to be, then every offensive either side launches on this front, ours or the Republic's, produces fuel for an enemy that answers to neither side's chain of command. This is not a threat we can simply add to the order of battle and continue the war around. It may require us to reconsider how the war itself is being fought. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, long enough that Tanya wondered if the connection had dropped. And when Zetor spoke again, his voice had the particular careful weight of a man already composing the briefing he'd have to give Rudersdorf within the hour. "Major," he said, "I want you to compile everything you observed, visual, tactical, the healing mechanism, all of it, into a full report, and have it on my desk within 2 hours. And Major, whatever restraint you've been exercising toward the Republic front for the sake of not overextending your battalion, I suspect that restraint is about to become considerably more expensive to maintain." "Understood, sir." She hung up the receiver and looked at the map table, at the red pin, at the rough sketch Weiss had already begun drawing of the trench line's collapse, and felt the particular cold settle into her that she associated with problems that did not have a clean tactical solution, only degrees of how badly things could go, and how much control she could claw back over which degree actually happened. "Serebryakov," she said, "I want a standing reconnaissance rotation on that rift. Minimum 4-man flights, strict rules of engagement. Observe, report. Do not engage unless directly threatened. I want to know everything that comes out of that tier before General Staff commits anything larger to this sector, because right now we know almost nothing. And the last time I fought an enemy, I understood less than I understand my own orb. It did not go particularly well for the people standing near me." She did not say Being X's name. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room who'd served with her long enough already knew exactly what she meant. Outside, the rain had not stopped, and 6 kilometers east, in the crater where the fighting had first broken the line, more shapes were still emerging from the rift, patient and unhurried, filling the space the war had left for them with the flat, mechanical certainty of something that had never once needed to hurry toward a fight. It was confident it would win. By the time General Kurt von Rudersdorf arrived at the forward Kampfgruppe's command post, the rain had finally eased to a heavy mist, and the eastern sector had gone quiet in the specific way Tanya had learned to distrust. Not the quiet of a battle won, but the quiet of a battle that hadn't decided yet whether it was actually over. Rudersdorf came with an escort of 6 mages and a driver who looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days, and he came without the usual theater of general staff visits. No aides fussing over maps, no ceremony. He walked into the farmhouse, still in his field coat, rain dripping off the shoulders, and went straight to the table, where Tanya's report lay finished and waiting. 4 pages of dense, precise observation that she'd written in the 2 hours Zetor had given her, and not a minute more. "Major!" He didn't sit. He read standing, one hand braced on the table's edge, and Tanya watched his face for the tells she'd learned to read over months of briefings, the faint tightening at the jaw that meant he'd hit something in the report he found genuinely alarming rather than merely inconvenient. It came at the 3rd page, at the paragraph describing the healing mechanism, and it didn't leave. "You're telling me," he said when he'd finished, "that we have an enemy combatant on this front whose supply chain is corpses." "That is my assessment, sir, based on direct observation. I recovered no data suggesting a mana dependency of any kind, no signature on approach, no distortion during combat, no vulnerability to interference formulas that I was able to test, though I'll note I did not have the luxury of a controlled experiment. What I observed was conventional kinetic and explosive damage causing visible harm, and blood recovered from the dead being used to close that harm in real time." She paused, chose the next words with the same care she chose every word in front of General Staff. "Sir, I want to raise the implication directly rather than let you infer it. If this pattern holds across whatever else came through that rift, then this is an enemy whose combat effectiveness scales with the intensity of the war around it. Every offensive, every barrage, Every trench assault that produces casualties on either side is, functionally, a supply convoy for them. Rudersdorf was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet Tanya watched him do what she'd watched him do a dozen times before in worse briefings than this one. Take a piece of information that should have provoked panic, and instead fold it, methodically, into the shape of a problem that could be worked. It was, she'd always privately thought, the single most useful trait a senior officer could have, and one of the few things about the Imperial General Staff she genuinely respected without reservation. Von Zetor is already drafting a containment directive, he said finally. Full sector cordon, aerial mage battalions rotated in from 3 adjacent commands, artillery held at minimum necessary rather than full barrage, which, I will tell you now, is going to be an extraordinarily unpopular order the moment field commanders realize General Staff is asking them to fight with one hand behind their backs against an enemy already inside our lines. He looked up from the report, and something in his expression had shifted from alarm into the flatter, harder register of a man who had already started planning. I want your battalion as the forward reconnaissance and rapid response element. You have direct engagement data no one else has. I want more of it, carefully, before I commit anything larger than a battalion to that sector. Understood, sir. She hesitated, then added the thing she'd been turning over since the engagement, the thing that mattered more than any tactical detail in the report. Sir, if I may, there is a second implication worth stating plainly. If this enemy's strength grows with the war's casualties, and this is a war we are already fighting at maximum sustainable intensity against the Republic, then the strategically rational response may not be simply to add a third front. It may require us to consider whether prolonging or intensifying the existing conflict serves our interests at all, given that every additional casualty, ours or theirs, strengthens a force that answers to neither of us. Rudersdorf's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did, the particular stillness of a career soldier being asked to consider, for the first time in longer than he'd like to admit, that the war he'd spent years prosecuting might no longer be the primary threat on his own front. That, he said slowly, is not a recommendation I can act on from a Kampfgruppe command post, Major. That is a recommendation for the Imperial High Command, possibly for the Emperor's own council, and I promise you it will not be received warmly by anyone whose career depends on this war continuing exactly as planned. I'm aware, sir. I'm not asking you to act on it. I'm asking that it be recorded as part of the strategic picture, so that when General Staff does eventually have to make that decision, they make it with accurate information, rather than having to relearn it after losing several more battalions to prove the point. It was, she reflected, about as close as she'd ever come to open political commentary in front of a General Staff officer, and she watched Rudersdorf's mouth twitch in something that wasn't quite a smile. Noted, Major. For what it's worth, I agree with you. Whether the rest of the General Staff will, is a different question entirely. He straightened, rain still darkening the shoulders of his coat, and the moment of shared unease passed back into the practical register both of them were more comfortable in. Your reconnaissance rotation, status. First flight is airborne now, sir. Strict observe and report parameters. I want to know the full scope of what came through that rift before we commit to any engagement doctrine, because right now we have exactly one data point. A single hostile that survived contact with an area denial formula and adapted its evasion pattern between the first and third shot fired at it. If the rest of what's coming through is comparably capable, this is not a threat 3 battalions can simply overwhelm with numbers. The reconnaissance flight found the second data point 40 minutes later, and Second Lieutenant Faust, recalled from the shattered forward line and reassigned, at his own quiet insistence, to accompany the recon element as a ground guide who actually knew what the thing looked like up close, was the one who saw it first, from the tree line 400 meters back where the flight had set down, to observe on foot, rather than risk another aerial engagement before General Staff had a clearer picture. It came out of the crater slowly, and at first Faust thought it was simply more of the small hunched things, another wave of the pale, jerking husks that had taken Kessler's ankle and not let go. But this was larger, broader. It moved on a low, wheeled base rather than legs, dragging a tank-shaped bulk behind a rust-eaten chassis, and where its head should have been, there was instead a long tapered nozzle and a faint, constant hiss of pressurized gas that Faust could hear even from 400 meters, a sound like a kettle that never quite reached its boil. Street cleaner, Weiss murmured beside him. He'd started calling them things, informal names for the shapes they'd catalogued, because General Staff wanted designations, and nobody in the flight had any better idea what to call a hissing gas tank on wheels. Grantz's report from the trench mentioned one like this, said it burned 3 men before they got clear. Degurechaff, lying prone in the wet grass with her field glasses steady, despite what Tanya could see was a very carefully controlled tremor in her hands, kept her voice low. "It's not alone, Major. There's—" She stopped, adjusted the glasses, and her voice went flatter, more careful, the tone of someone reporting something she needed to be believed rather than dismissed as exaggeration. "There's 3 of the rifle ones. Soldiers. They're not moving randomly. They're holding a perimeter around the rift mouth. That's formation discipline, Major. That's not animal behavior. Something is coordinating them, or they're coordinating themselves." Tanya took the glasses when Degurechaff passed them across, and confirmed it herself with the particular grim satisfaction of a hypothesis being validated by evidence she'd rather it hadn't been. 3 of the rifle-armed automatons, soldiers, Weiss's designation was as good as any, stood at roughly even intervals around the rift's mouth, weapons held at a low ready that looked, disturbingly, exactly like Imperial infantry doctrine for holding a defensive perimeter. Behind them, deeper in the crater, more shapes moved in the red-lit dark of the rift's threshold, and further back still, she could feel it before she could properly see it. A vibration in the ground, faint but rhythmic, transmitted up through 400 meters of wet earth into the soles of her boots even from this distance. "Something bigger is still coming through," she said, quietly, and did not need to elaborate, because everyone lying in the wet grass beside her had felt the same tremor and drawn the same conclusion. She lowered the glasses and looked at the sky, gauging light, gauging the 2 hours of usable daylight left before the mist thickened into full dark, and made the calculation she'd known she'd eventually have to make since the moment she read Faust's panicked report over the field telephone that morning. This was not a threat she had enough information to fight yet, and every additional hour spent gathering information was an hour that whatever was still coming through the rift used to finish arriving. "Pull back," she said. "Full report to Rudersdorf. Perimeter discipline confirmed. Additional mass movement detected below ground level. Estimated 2 hours of daylight remaining before conditions favor the hostile force over any Imperial response." She folded the glasses closed and looked once, briefly, toward the rift's red glow, pulsing faintly through the mist like something with a heartbeat. "I want General Staff to understand, in terms they can act on immediately. Whatever is still down there is bigger than anything that's come through so far, and it is not in any hurry, because it doesn't need to be. Time is on its side. It is not on ours." Behind them, unseen, unhurried, the ground beneath the rift's threshold shifted again. A vast, patient displacement of earth that had nothing to do with the small machines holding their perimeter above, and somewhere in the red-lit dark below, something with the mass of a fortress and the singular purpose of grinding forward began, very slowly, to move. General Staff Headquarters in the rear did not, as a rule, panic. Tanya had spent enough of her career around senior Imperial officers, to know that panic was a luxury reserved for men who hadn't yet learned that composure, even manufactured composure, was itself a tactical asset, a way of keeping subordinates from making the exact mistakes fear produced. But when she was summoned to the sector command bunker 2 days after the rift's first appearance, she found something in the room that was not quite panic, and not quite composure either. It was the particular tension of very disciplined men confronting a problem that refused to fit inside any of the frameworks they'd spent their careers building. Rudersdorf was there, and Zetur beside him, and a third man Tanya didn't immediately recognize, older, in the black-trimmed vestments of the Church of Being X's military liaison office, which was itself unusual enough to make her recalibrate her expectations for the meeting before it had even started. General Staff did not typically invite the church into operational briefings. That they had now meant someone, somewhere up the chain, had already started asking questions Tanya suspected the church wasn't going to have satisfying answers to. Major von Degurechaff. Zetur gestured her to the map table without preamble, which was itself a small mercy. She'd learned to appreciate officers who didn't waste time on ceremony when the situation didn't warrant it. You're aware the reconnaissance rotation you established has been running for 48 hours. I want your assessment of what we now know, and I want it blunt. She gave it to them blunt. The rift had not expanded, but it had not closed either. It sat in the collapsed trench line like an open wound that had simply stopped bleeding without healing, admitting a slow, steady trickle of hostiles rather than the initial surge. The perimeter discipline Degurechaff had first identified had held and, if anything, tightened. The soldiers rotated through watch positions with a regularity that suggested either communication between units or some shared operational logic none of them had a name for. 2 more reconnaissance flights had drawn fire when they'd strayed too close, and in both cases the hostiles had adjusted their engagement pattern based on the previous flight's approach vector, a fact that had cost one flight a wounded mage, and confirmed, beyond any reasonable doubt, that whatever was coordinating this force learned from every encounter. And the mass movement your report flagged, Rudersdorf said. Below ground level. We haven't confirmed its shape, sir, only its presence. Ground vibration consistent with something very large moving very slowly, roughly 200 meters below the rift's threshold, and not yet approaching the surface. My working assessment is that whatever it is, it hasn't finished arriving. The machines holding the perimeter may simply be buying it time. The church liaison. Tanya caught his name from the placard in front of him, Father Ludwig Senholt, and filed it without particular interest, since her opinion of the church's operational usefulness had never been high, and this briefing was doing nothing to improve it. Leaned forward with the specific solemnity of a man about to say something he considered theologically significant. Major, I understand you've reported no mana signature associated with any of these hostiles. I'd ask you to consider the possibility that this absence is itself the signature, that we are dealing with a force outside the natural order, possibly infernal in origin, and that conventional military doctrine may be insufficient regardless of tactical adjustment. Tanya kept her expression perfectly neutral, which took more effort than she'd have liked to admit, because her actual opinion, that the church's instinct to reach for theology the moment a problem exceeded its analytical toolkit, was exactly the kind of unfalsifiable nonsense that got soldiers killed while priests wrote reports, was not an opinion she could voice in front of General Staff without consequences she couldn't currently afford. Father, I have no theological framework to offer you, only tactical observation. What I can tell you is that conventional kinetic and explosive force demonstrably harms these hostiles. Whether their point of origin is infernal, dimensional, or something else entirely, they die, or at minimum, sustain damage, the same way anything else on this battlefield does. I would suggest that is the more actionable data point. Senholt's mouth thinned slightly, But Zetor cut in before the exchange could develop into the kind of doctrinal argument that wasted everyone's time. The Major's point stands regardless of origin, Father. We fight what we can measure. Theology can inform strategy once we have a strategy that survives contact with the enemy. He turned back to the map, tapping the red pin marking the rift's location with 2 fingers. Major, I want your honest operational recommendation. Not what General Staff wants to hear. What you believe will actually work. Tanya considered the question with the weight it deserved, because General Staff rarely asked for honest recommendations rather than confirmations of decisions already made, and when they did, it was usually because the decision genuinely hadn't been made yet, and her answer might actually shape it. Sir, my recommendation has 2 parts, and I suspect the first will be unpopular. She kept her voice level, professional, and did not soften what came next. First, I do not believe this is a threat that can be contained indefinitely by rotating aerial mage battalions through observation duty. Every hour we spend gathering data is an hour the mass beneath the rift continues arriving, uncontested. I recommend a coordinated strike, full battalion strength, concentrated explosive formulas, time to catch the perimeter machines in the open rather than dug in, before whatever's still coming through has finished emerging. Waiting favors them. It does not favor us. And the second part, Rudersdorf said, when she paused. The second part is the one General Staff will like considerably less, sir. I recommend this strike be planned and resourced independently of the Republic front, without drawing down forces currently committed against the Republic. And I recommend General Staff begin, quietly, assessing what a negotiated cessation of hostilities with the Republic might cost us, as a contingency. She watched the room's temperature drop several degrees at that. Watched Senholt's face go carefully blank in the specific way clergy affected when they disapproved of something they weren't yet certain they had standing to object to, and pressed on anyway, because she'd already decided, walking into this briefing, that the political cost of saying it now was considerably lower than the cost of not saying it, and being proven right in 6 weeks by a casualty report nobody wanted to read. I raised this to General von Rudersdorf 2 days ago, and I'll raise it again here. If this enemy's strength scales with battlefield casualties, then continuing to fight the Republic at current intensity is, functionally, subsidizing our new enemy's war effort. I am not recommending unconditional surrender to the Republic, sir. I am recommending that someone with the authority to do so begin evaluating whether an armistice, even a temporary one, might be the single most effective weapon we currently have against the actual existential threat on this front. The silence that followed was long enough that Tanya had time to run through, twice, every plausible way this recommendation could end her career, and had already concluded that she stood by it regardless, because being right and unemployed was a considerably better outcome than being agreeable and dead. It was Zetor who broke the silence, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular dry weight of a man arriving at a conclusion he'd clearly already been circling on his own. The Major is not wrong that this will be unpopular. I doubt the Emperor's Council will entertain armistice terms on the strength of a single Kampfgruppe commander's tactical report, however sound her reasoning. He looked at Rudersdorf, and something passed between the two men that Tanya recognized as the particular shorthand of officers who'd worked together long enough to not need full sentences. But I will carry the recommendation upward, framed as a contingency, rather than a demand. That much, I think, we owe the Major for having the nerve to say it plainly. Thank you, sir. She kept the relief off her face, because relief was not a professional expression, but she felt it nonetheless. Not because she expected the recommendation to be adopted quickly, if at all, but because getting it into the record, on paper, attributed to her, meant that when the war's actual trajectory eventually forced the question, someone would remember she'd raised it first. For now, Rudersdorf said, We act on your first recommendation. I'm authorizing a coordinated strike, your battalion as spearhead, given your direct engagement experience. 2 additional aerial mage battalions in support. Artillery preparation limited to avoid feeding the enemy's apparent supply mechanism as much as possible. Timing? Dawn, sir, if the mist holds. Low visibility favors us against a force that relies on visual tracking, and the perimeter rotation we've observed suggests a shift change occurs roughly every 4 hours. I want to hit during a transition window, when their coverage is thinnest. Approved. Prepare your battalion. Rudersdorf's expression, as he said it, carried none of the confidence she was used to hearing from him before a conventional engagement, and she understood, watching him, that he was as uncertain about the coming strike as she was, that for the first time in this war, neither of them actually believed the plan on the table was likely to be sufficient, only that it was the best plan available, given what they knew, and sometimes that was simply what command came down to. That night, in the farmhouse that had become her battalion's forward billet, Tanya lay on a cot that was too short for even her diminutive frame, and stared at a ceiling beam stained with old water damage, and did the thing she rarely allowed herself to do outside of active crisis. She thought, honestly, about the shape of the problem, rather than the tactics of solving it. A war economy built on scarcity, mana scarce enough that every nation on the continent had organized its entire military doctrine around husbanding it, rationing it, treating every mage as a strategic asset too valuable to spend carelessly, had just acquired an enemy for whom scarcity meant nothing, because its economy ran on something the war produced in unlimited, tragic abundance. It was, she thought, almost elegantly cruel, the kind of design that a truly malicious god might construct specifically to mock the entire logic the Empire had built its survival on. She did not think Being X had built this. She'd have felt it, some resonance, some trace of that insufferable presence's fingerprints on the phenomenon, and she'd felt nothing. But she noted, with the particular grim humor she reserved for moments too dark to process any other way, that whether or not Being X had engineered this specific catastrophe, it was exactly the kind of test that entity seemed to delight in constructing. A mirror held up to the war's own logic, reflecting back its worst assumption, that human lives were a resource to be spent, calculated, optimized, and that the calculation would always, eventually, balance in the favor of whoever spent them most efficiently. Except now, the ledger had a third party reading it, and that third party did not care who won. She closed her eyes, and did not sleep well, and 4 hours before dawn, when Serebriakoff came to wake her for the strike, she was already awake, already dressed, already running the numbers one more time in the dark, because rational actors prepared for every contingency they could imagine, and the one she couldn't stop imagining was the one where dawn came and the strike simply wasn't enough. Dawn came gray and reluctant, mist clinging low over the churned earth in ragged sheets that thinned and thickened unpredictably, and Tanya held her battalion at 400 meters, watching the world resolve itself slowly out of the fog below. 3 aerial mage battalions hung in loose formation around her, her own 203rd at the point. 2 borrowed battalions from adjacent Kampfgruppen fanned out to either flank, close to 60 mages in total, more concentrated firepower than she'd commanded in a single engagement since the worst weeks of the Rhine campaign's early offensives. It should have felt like overwhelming force. It felt, instead, like the uneasy calculation of a woman who had already watched a single hostile survive a direct hit and adjust its evasion pattern in real time, multiplied now by an unknown number of unknowns. "Report," she said over the command channel. "Low. Perimeter positions unchanged from last observation, Major." That was Captain Adler, no relation to the dead private from Faust's Trench, an unfortunate coincidence of Imperial naming conventions that had made the morning's roll call briefly unsettling. Commanding the Eastern Flank Battalion, 3 soldiers visible at standard watch positions. No sign of the primary hostile from your first engagement. It's there, Tanya said, with more certainty than she strictly had data for. But 4 days of running the numbers had given her a working model of how this enemy operated, and the model said a force this disciplined didn't leave its most capable unit unaccounted for. Assume its position to respond to whichever sector takes the heaviest engagement. Do not assume you have a clear kill on the perimeter soldiers, without confirming the primary hostile's location first. Below, the mist shifted, and for a moment she had clear sight down into the crater, the rift's mouth still pulsing that same wet, arterial red. The 3 soldiers holding their watch positions with the mechanical patience that had unsettled every recon flight that had observed them. And behind them, deeper in the crater's shadow, more shapes she couldn't yet resolve. On my mark, she said. Concentrated explosion formulas, full spread, targeting the perimeter positions and the rift mouth simultaneously. I want maximum damage in the first strike, before they've had time to reorganize around whatever losses they take. She gave the mark. 60 mages loosed their formulas within the same half-second window, and the crater erupted, a rolling wall of white-orange mana fire that swallowed the perimeter positions whole, through earth and shattered metal 100 feet into the mist. And for one brief, savage moment, Tanya let herself believe the strike had simply worked. That overwhelming force applied cleanly, and early had solved the problem the way overwhelming force solved most problems in this war. Then the mist cleared on the crater's edge, and she saw what the strike had actually accomplished, and understood immediately that she'd been wrong. 2 of the 3 soldiers were gone, reduced to scattered wreckage. The 3rd had taken cover, not fled, taken cover, ducking behind the twisted remains of an Imperial artillery piece with a precision that suggested it had assessed the strike's blast radius in the half-second before impact and positioned itself accordingly. And rising from the crater's deeper shadow, unhurried, its lens already fixed on her position with the same uncanny certainty as their first engagement, came V1. It had changed since their last encounter. Not physically. The gunmetal plating looked the same. The wound she'd opened along its shoulder fully closed now, no trace remaining. But in the way it moved, something had shifted, a fluidity to its motion that hadn't been there before, as if 4 days of feeding on whatever the rift's perimeter machines had managed to harvest had sharpened something in it, beyond simple repair. Concentrate fire on the primary hostile, she called, and 30 mages redirected their formulas toward the single gray figure now cutting across the crater floor at a speed that made her instrument's targeting solutions lag half a second behind its actual position. It should not have been possible to dodge 60 converging formulas. Tanya had built her entire combat doctrine around the mathematical certainty that concentrated fire from multiple angles closed off evasion options faster than any single target could process them. And she watched, with something that was no longer merely clinical interest but a cold, specific dread. As V1 threaded the gap between 3 separate blast radii with margins measured in inches, using the explosion's own displaced earth as cover, in a way that suggested it wasn't simply reacting to each formula individually, but reading the entire pattern, predicting where the next several seconds of fire would fall, and routing itself through the spaces that would remain empty. "It's not dodging us," she said, mostly to herself, running the observation through her threat model and not liking where it led. "It's solving us." The revolver came up mid-stride, and this time it wasn't aiming at her. It found Captain Adler first. A single shot, center of mass, and Adler dropped out of formation trailing smoke from a wound that would have killed a lesser mage outright. And before the formation had finished processing the loss, the weapon had already cycled and found a second target, one of Adler's lieutenants, and a third. Fall back to secondary formation. Do not engage in a straight line. Break pattern. Tanya was already moving as she gave the order, cutting hard laterally rather than continuing her approach, and she felt rather than saw Weiss and Degurechaff adjusting to cover her, the three of them falling into the loose, unpredictable weave they drilled 100 times against Republic ace mages, a formation built specifically to deny a single skilled marksman a clean read on any one target's trajectory. It worked, marginally. V1's fourth shot went wide, clipping the edge of Weiss's flight path rather than finding him outright, and in the half-second that bought them, Tanya saw an opening she hadn't expected. The thing had planted itself, briefly stationary while it tracked the formation's scattered movement, and stationary was the one condition under which her explosion formulas actually landed clean. She took the shot. The formula caught V1 square in the chest this time, full force, no glancing graze, and the blast threw it backward into the crater wall hard enough to crack the ancient stone of a collapsed trench support beam behind it. For a moment, watching the smoke clear, she let herself hope. Then V1 straightened out of the rubble, and where the formula should have left a wound comparable to the shoulder gouge from their first engagement, there was instead only a faint discoloration in the gray plating, already fading, and Tanya understood, with the specific cold clarity of a hypothesis being confirmed in the worst possible way, that 4 days of feeding hadn't just healed the previous wound. It had made the armor itself more resistant to the exact kind of damage that had hurt it the first time. It's adapting to us specifically, she thought, not just healing, learning what hurts it and closing the gap. General withdrawal, she said, and heard her own voice come out flatter than she intended. The particular flatness that meant she was suppressing something she didn't have time to feel yet. All battalions, disengage and fall back to the rally point. This is not a fight we finish today. The order cost them. V1 did not simply let a withdrawing force leave clean. 3 more mages took wounds covering the retreat. One badly enough that Degurechaff had to break off her own covering fire to help stabilize the fall, and by the time the shattered remains of 3 battalions regrouped at the rally point 8 kilometers west, Tanya's count came to 9 dead and 11 wounded, against a strike that had destroyed exactly 2 of the enemy's smallest, least significant units, and left the one that actually mattered stronger than it had been that morning. She stood at the rally point's makeshift command table, rain beginning again in the thin, cold way that suggested it intended to stay for days, and did the math she'd been dreading since the mist first cleared over the crater. Overwhelming force had not been overwhelming. It had been, if anything, an education. For V1, and for her. Somewhere behind her, she heard Weiss trying, quietly, to reassure one of Adler's surviving lieutenants that the losses hadn't been for nothing, and she let him have that fiction, because morale required it, and she wasn't cruel enough to correct him in front of the wounded. But privately, running the numbers one final time before she had to compose the report General Staff was waiting for, she arrived at a conclusion considerably darker than anything she'd let herself voice in yesterday's briefing. This enemy did not simply resist attrition. It converted attrition into strength. And the only strategy the Empire actually knew how to execute, mass, concentrated, overwhelming firepower, the same doctrine that had carried them through every engagement against the Republic, was, against this specific threat, not merely insufficient. It was actively making the problem worse. Continue. 300 kilometers south of the failed strike, in a stretch of contested farmland the front lines had passed over twice already that season, the mercenary company known as the Iron Wolves Kampfgruppe had spent the morning doing what mercenary companies did best in a war of scarcity, turning other people's disaster into a line item. Erich Baumann had been running salvage operations behind the front for 6 years, long enough to have developed a professional's eye for the particular signature of a battlefield worth picking clean, abandoned Imperial materiel, Republic equipment stripped from the dead, the occasional intact orb core that could fetch more on the gray market than most soldiers made in a year. He had not expected, when his company's scouts brought back word of a new front opening east where the fighting had gone strange, that the opportunity in front of him would be quite this large, or quite this unsettling. "Talk to me," he said, standing at the edge of his company's makeshift camp, watching a column of refugee traffic thin out along the muddy road that ran east, toward the sector everyone was now calling, with the grim economy of soldiers who didn't waste words on things they didn't understand. The bleeding front. His scout, a wiry Legedonian who went by Casper and had a gift for surviving reconnaissance that Bauman had learned not to question too closely, spread a hand-drawn sketch across the folding table between them. Imperial forces hit whatever's out there this morning. Big engagement. 3 battalions from what we could count off the Manifire. They pulled back inside 2 hours. Whatever's holding that ground, the Imperials didn't clear it. And the field, untouched, Herr Baumann. Imperial dead still out there. Some Republic dead further west from the old front line before it collapsed east. And whatever the Imperials were fighting, it's still sitting on top of a battlefield with more abandoned equipment than I've seen in one place since the Dnieper crossing. Casper's expression, usually the flat professional mask of a man who'd long since stopped being troubled by the ordinary horrors of scavenging, carried something else this time, a hesitation that Bauman had learned, over 6 years, to take seriously. "There's also something you should know before you send the crews out there. The bodies, some of them aren't whole, sir, like something's been at them." Bauman had heard enough rumors over the past 4 days, passed soldier to soldier, camp to camp, the way rumors always outran official reports, to have a working theory about what "something's been at them" meant. And he didn't love the theory, but he'd also built a company that survived on exploiting exactly the kind of chaos this war kept producing, and a mercenary Kampfgruppe that turned down opportunity out of squeamishness didn't stay solvent long enough to matter. "We're not going near whatever's actually fighting," he said, thinking it through as he spoke, the calculation as automatic to him now as breathing. "We wait until the Imperial recon rotation clears out. We go in fast on the western edge of that field, furthest from wherever the actual hostiles are holding, grab what we can carry in 20 minutes, and we're gone before anyone official notices a mercenary company was ever there. Orb cores first, then small arms, then anything with resale value. I don't want anyone within 400 meters of that crater they're all talking about. And if General Staff asks questions about who's looting an active engagement zone," Bauman allowed himself a thin smile, the particular expression of a man who had navigated exactly this kind of bureaucratic friction more times than he could count. "General Staff has considerably bigger questions to answer right now than where a few dozen abandoned Type 95 orbs ended up. We're not the problem on that front, Casper. We're barely a footnote. Let's make sure it stays that way." It was, by the calculus that had kept the Iron Wolves in business through 6 years of a war that chewed through smaller, less careful companies with grim regularity, a sound plan. It also very nearly got all of them killed, because Bauman's information was 4 hours stale by the time his crews reached the field, and in those 4 hours, the perimeter around the rift had not contracted after the Imperial withdrawal. It had expanded. The first sign that something had gone wrong came when Casper, 40 meters ahead of the main salvage crew and moving low along a shattered stretch of trench wall, froze mid-step and raised a closed fist. The old signal, stop, contact, and Bauman, following 20 meters back, felt his stomach drop with the particular cold certainty of a man realizing his careful plan had already stopped mattering. The thing standing in the trench ahead of Casper was not one of the small hunched shapes the rumors had described, and it was not the gunmetal marksman that Imperial soldiers were already trading nervous stories about in every rear area tavern within 20 kilometers. It was larger, Not massively so, but broader through the shoulders, built with a bulk that suggested weight rather than speed, its plating a darker iron gray scored with what looked, disturbingly, like old scarring rather than fresh damage, as if this particular machine had survived a great many more fights than the ones it had fought since arriving in this war. It was crouched over one of the morning's Imperial dead, and unlike the small feeding husks Bauman's scouts had described, it was not simply draining blood in some crude mechanical process. It was doing something more deliberate, more surgical, and Bauman, who had seen a great many terrible things in 6 years of picking apart the aftermath of battles, found himself unable to look away from the specific, precise economy of the motion. The sense that whatever this thing was doing, it had done it enough times to have refined it into something approaching craft. Casper did not wait to find out what would happen if it noticed him. He was already backing away, slow, careful, the old salvager's instinct for not making sudden movements near something that might be faster than you kicking in with the force of pure animal self-preservation. When the thing's head came up, not with the sudden mechanical snap Bauman had half expected, but slowly, almost lazily, a predator confirming an interruption it had already sensed coming, and fixed on Casper with an attention that made the hair on the back of Bauman's neck rise despite the 60 meters of distance between himself and the confrontation. "Fall back," Bauman said, low, into the small mana-resonant signaling device every salvage crew carried for exactly this kind of situation. "Everyone, fall back now. Full retreat to the tree line. Do not engage." His crews were professionals, whatever else could be said about the ethics of their profession, and they moved fast and disciplined, which was very nearly enough. It was not quite enough for the two men closest to Casper's position, a pair of brothers named Volkmann, who'd been with the company for 3 years and had, until that morning, survived worse odds than this, on at least 4 separate occasions. The larger machine did not chase them in any conventional sense. It simply moved, a burst of speed that closed 30 meters in under 2 seconds, brutal and efficient rather than showy, and Bauman, watching from the tree line with his heart hammering against his ribs, saw the elder Volkmann brother go down without ever getting a shot off, and watched the younger one make the terrible human mistake of stopping to try to help his brother, rather than continuing to run. By the time the survivors reached the tree line, the company had lost both Volkmanns and a third man named Reiner, who'd taken a wound covering the retreat, and Bauman stood among the ragged, breathing survivors of his once proud salvage operation, with the particular grief of a commander who had gotten men killed chasing a profit margin, and made himself, in that moment, a promise he intended to keep, regardless of what it cost the company's balance sheet going forward. "We're done with that field," he said. To no one in particular, to everyone. Whatever's happening out there, that's not a war zone anymore. That's something else, and we're not going anywhere near it again until somebody with considerably more firepower than a mercenary Kampfgruppe has actually settled the question of who's in charge of that ground. Casper, still pale, still shaking faintly from adrenaline, looked back once toward the field they'd fled, toward the faint red glow visible even from this distance through the thickening mist. Herr Baumann, that thing back there, the big one, it wasn't just killing the Volkmanns for the sake of it. It looked like it was. He struggled for the word, and Baumann, who had already arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion during the retreat, supplied it for him. "Curating," Baumann said quietly. It looked like it was curating them, like there was something specific it wanted, and everything else was just in the way. He turned from the field, already thinking through how he was going to explain 3 dead men to their families, and how he was going to explain to General Staff, because this, unlike the quiet matter of a few looted orb cores, was information that had to reach someone with the authority to act on it. Exactly what his company had stumbled into. "I want a runner to the nearest Imperial post within the hour. Whatever pride we've got left about staying off General Staff's books, it doesn't matter anymore. They need to know these things aren't just holding a perimeter. Some of them are hunting specifically, and I don't think we want to find out what they're hunting for. Behind them, unseen, the larger machine, designated in General Staff's eventual reports. Once Bauman's account reached the appropriate desk, only as Hostile Type 2, elevated threat classification pending, straightened from what remained of the Volkmann brothers, and turned its attention, unhurried, back toward the rift's mouth, where the ground had begun, almost imperceptibly, to tremble again with the deep, patient rhythm of something enormous, drawing steadily closer to the surface. The report reached Zetur's desk at 11 that night, carried by a runner from Bauman's company who had ridden 2 horses half to death to make the delivery inside the hour Bauman had promised, and Zetur read it standing in the lamplight of his rear area office, with the particular grim focus of a man who had stopped being surprised by bad news and had started, instead, simply cataloging how much worse each new report made the overall picture. He summoned Rudersdorf at midnight, and summoned Tanya an hour after that, pulling her out of the first real sleep she'd managed since the failed strike, and by the time she arrived at the sector command bunker, hair still damp from the field wash basin, uniform hastily correct rather than immaculate, she found both senior officers already deep in a conversation that stopped the moment she entered, which told her, before either of them said a word, that whatever they'd been discussing was not something they'd fully decided how to frame for her yet. Major, Zetur slid Bauman's report across the table without preamble. Read this. She read it twice, the second time more slowly, because the first pass had left her with a conclusion she wanted to be certain she wasn't overreading from an unreliable civilian source. A mercenary company. A larger, distinct hostile type, scarred rather than freshly damaged, exhibiting what the report's author, clearly not a trained intelligence analyst, but observant enough that Tanya found herself trusting the account regardless, described as deliberate, almost surgical selection among the dead, rather than the indiscriminate feeding she'd observed from the smaller units. It's not simply consuming blood for repair, she said slowly, thinking it through as she spoke. If this account is accurate, there's a second-tier hostile that's selecting specific targets, rather than harvesting indiscriminately. That's a meaningfully different threat profile than what I engaged 3 days ago. That was my read as well. Zetur's voice carried the particular dryness he used when he was more unsettled than he wanted to show. Which raises a question I don't currently have an answer to, Major. And I suspect you don't either. What is it selecting for? Tanya turned the question over, running it against everything she'd observed and everything Bauman's account added to the picture, and arrived, slowly, at an answer she didn't like. Sir, I'd need more data to be confident, but if I had to build a working hypothesis, the smaller hostiles, the ones we've been calling filth, they feed indiscriminately, opportunistically, whatever's nearest. V1, the primary hostile from my engagement, showed no interest in feeding during our fight at all. Its priority was clearly combat, not consumption. If this new type is selecting specifically among the dead, it may be looking for something the others don't need: stronger blood, more combat-capable targets. Which would mean, she paused, letting the implication settle before she said it outright, because it was the kind of implication that changed the entire strategic calculus, which would mean the more capable our own soldiers are, the more valuable they become as a target for this specific hostile type. Our best mages, our most experienced infantry, they may be worth more to this thing dead than an ordinary conscript would be. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence after her armistice recommendation 4 days earlier. That silence had been political discomfort. This one was closer to genuine horror, carefully restrained by 2 men who had spent decades training themselves not to show it. If that's true, Rudersdorf said finally, then this war has just inverted one of the only certainties we've ever had. Concentrating our best assets for maximum tactical effect has always been sound doctrine. If our best assets are now the highest value targets for an enemy that grows stronger by killing them specifically, then concentration of force becomes a liability rather than a strength, sir. Yes. Tanya finished the thought, because Rudersdorf, she could see, did not want to be the one to finish it himself. I want to stress, this is a hypothesis, not confirmed intelligence. But if General Staff is planning any further engagement against this front, I'd recommend operating on the assumption that it's true until proven otherwise, because the cost of being wrong in the other direction, assuming it isn't true and being mistaken, is considerably higher. Zetor was quiet for a long moment, turning Bauman's report over in his hands without reading it again, clearly already past the point of needing to. There is a second matter I want to raise, Major, and I want your honest reaction, not a diplomatic one. He set the report down. The Emperor's Council received General von Rudersdorf's contingency framing of your armistice recommendation 2 days ago. I have not had a formal reply, but I have had informal word, through channels I trust, that the Council is taking it more seriously than either of us expected. Not because they've suddenly developed sympathy for the Republic, because 3 other sectors have now reported comparable rift phenomena in the past 36 hours, and the Council is beginning to understand that whatever this is, it is not confined to a single stretch of the Rhine Front. It may be a continental problem, possibly larger. Tanya felt something in her chest go very still, the particular stillness of a threat model that had just expanded past the boundary of anything she'd been planning against. Other sectors, sir. Which fronts? One report from the Republic's own lines, west of here, passed to us through a prisoner exchange channel, of all things, which tells you something about how frightened the Republic Command currently is, if they're volunteering intelligence to the enemy they're at war with. One from the Federation border, unconfirmed, and one, Major, from considerably further south, in a sector abutting Ildoan territory, which if accurate, means this is not a phenomenon isolated to the specific site of your engagement. It may be happening wherever this war's violence has concentrated most intensely. The implication landed on Tanya with the particular clarity of a puzzle piece finally fitting into a shape she'd been circling for days without quite seeing whole. Not a single rift, opened by chance at a single testing site. A pattern. A response, however impersonal, however mechanical, to the sheer accumulated violence of a continent that had been grinding itself to pieces for years, as if something on the other side of whatever separated this world from wherever these machines came from had finally noticed how much blood this war had spilled, and decided that blood was worth harvesting. If that's the pattern, she said slowly, then this isn't a threat we contain by winning a single engagement, sir. It's a threat that scales with the war itself, wherever the war is worst, which means the Empire fighting harder, anywhere, against anyone, may simply be opening more doors. Which is precisely the recommendation you made 4 days ago, Zetor said, though I don't think either of us fully understood, at the time, quite how literally correct you might turn out to be. He looked between Tanya and Rudersdorf, and something in his expression settled into the particular grim resolve of a man who had just accepted that the next several weeks of his career were going to be spent arguing an unpopular position to people who did not want to hear it. I intend to carry this upward with considerably more urgency than before, Major. I want your full report, and Bauman's, both attached, and I want you to understand, this is not a promise the Council will act quickly, or act at all. Institutions this large do not turn on a single briefing, however alarming. But I will make certain the information reaches people who can no longer credibly claim ignorance of it. Understood, sir. What are my orders regarding the front itself? Rudersdorf answered that one, his voice heavier than she'd heard it in the 4 days since this began. Hold position, Major. No further offensive action against the rift until General Staff has a doctrine that accounts for what we now know. No concentration of elite forces near active hostile zones. Defensive engagement only, and I want your battalion specifically rotated back from the front line for at least 72 hours. If Bauman's account is accurate, and this hostile type is selecting for combat-capable targets, I am not willing to leave the officer with the most direct engagement experience against this enemy sitting exposed on the front line a moment longer than necessary. It was, Tanya recognized, both a sound tactical decision and something else. A flicker of genuine concern from a general staff officer who did not, as a rule, extend that kind of concern to subordinates regardless of their tactical value, and she filed the observation away without comment. Because there was nothing useful to say about it, and because some very old, very buried part of her, the part that had crossed over into this war with nothing but the conviction that survival was the only value worth optimizing for, found the gesture landing somewhere she hadn't expected it to land. "Understood, sir," she said again, and meant it, and did not examine too closely why the order to step back from danger, for once, came as something closer to relief than frustration. The 72 hours of stand-down did not, as Tanya had half expected, bring quiet. It brought instead a different kind of pressure, the particular exhausting work of watching a crisis metastasize from a distance, unable to act, forced to process fragments of intelligence as they trickled in from 3 different fronts, while her own battalion sat idle at a rear billet, 20 kilometers from the rift that had started it all. She used the time as productively as her temperament allowed, which meant she spent most of it in the billet's requisition study, cross-referencing every fragment of intelligence Zetor's office forwarded her against her own direct observations, building a model of the enemy that grew more disquieting with every addition. The Republic Front's rift, according to the prisoner exchange intelligence, had opened in a stretch of contested ground that had seen 3 major offensives in as many months, the single bloodiest sector on the western half of the continent. The Federation border report, once confirmed, traced to a site where Federation and Imperial forces had fought an 11-day battle of attrition the previous winter, a battle so costly that both sides had quietly agreed, without ever formally acknowledging it, not to contest that particular stretch of ground again. Wherever the war had bled hardest, the rifts followed. It was Degurechaff, on the second day of stand-down, who asked the question Tanya had been circling, without quite letting herself voice it aloud. "Major!" Her adjutant stood in the study doorway, with a fresh dispatch in hand, but she didn't offer it immediately, which meant something was on her mind first. If the pattern's real, if these things are opening wherever the fighting's worst, does that mean the Empire caused this? Not just the Rhine Front specifically, all of it, every offensive, every battle we've fought to win this war. Did we open the door for something that wants to kill everyone on both sides indiscriminately? Tanya set down the report she'd been reading and considered the question with more care than she gave most things Degurechaff asked her, because it deserved care, and because she suspected her adjutant had been sitting with this particular fear for longer than she'd let on. "I don't have a confirmed causal mechanism, Lieutenant. What I have is correlation between violence intensity and rift emergence, which is not the same thing as proof that any single actor's decision specifically triggered it. The Republic fought as hard as we did. The Federation fought as hard as both of us combined, in places. If there is blame to assign, it does not belong exclusively to the Empire, and I would caution you against carrying guilt for a phenomenon that, as far as we currently understand it, appears to be a consequence of this entire war's structure, rather than any single nation's choices within it. That's not really an answer to whether we caused it, Major. That's an answer about who else also caused it." Tanya looked at her adjutant for a long moment, and felt something that wasn't quite surprise. Degurechaff had grown considerably sharper over the months they'd served together, sharper than the earnest, slightly overwhelmed Lieutenant Tanya remembered from their earliest deployments. and found herself, for once, without an immediate rebuttal that fully satisfied her own standards for intellectual honesty. "No," she admitted, "it isn't. I don't have a clean answer for you, Victoria, because I don't think there is one. If the correlation holds, then this war, the whole of it, every nation that's fed it, ourselves very much included, has, through its own accumulated violence, produced a threat that answers to none of us, and threatens all of us equally. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with. I'm not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of making you feel better about it." Degurechaff absorbed that, and something in her expression settled, not into ease, but into the particular steadiness of someone who had wanted an honest answer more than a comforting one, and had gotten it. "Then I suppose the only thing that actually matters is what we do about it now, not who's to blame for it existing." "That," Tanya said, "is precisely the correct conclusion, Lieutenant, and I'd commend you for reaching it faster than most of General Staff appears to have managed." She held out a hand for the dispatch, and Degurechaff passed it across, and whatever was in it, Tanya could see, from her adjutant's expression, that it wasn't good news. Clearly explained why she'd led with the philosophical question first. The dispatch was from Zetour's office, and it was short, which in Tanya's experience with General Staff communications was rarely a good sign, because officers who had good news tended to elaborate on it, and officers who had bad news tended to compress it into the fewest words that satisfied their reporting obligations. "Confirmed. 4th rift site identified. Southern Ildoan border sector. 5th site suspected. Unconfirmed. Commonwealth Northern Theater. Council convening emergency session within the week. Your armistice recommendation formally tabled for discussion. Republic Command has independently signaled willingness to discuss terms, citing shared strategic concerns, through the same prisoner exchange channel. Details to follow. Hold position. Zed." Tanya read it twice, and felt something in her chest that she recognized, after a moment of honest self-examination, as the specific, disorienting sensation of a recommendation she'd made half out of desperate pragmatism, actually beginning to move through the machinery of a government large and slow enough that she'd genuinely expected it to die quietly in committee. "The Republic wants to talk," she said aloud, mostly to test how the words sounded outside her own head. "Sir Zetour's dispatch. Republic Command is signaling willingness to discuss terms." Degurechaff's eyebrows rose. "That's, Major, that's the recommendation you made a week ago. They're actually considering it." "They're considering it because they're frightened, Lieutenant, which is a considerably less noble motivation than wisdom, but produces the same practical outcome. And I will take a frightened peace over a courageous continuation of a war that's actively strengthening an enemy that wants us all equally dead." She set the dispatch down and allowed herself, for just a moment, the small, uncharacteristic indulgence of feeling something like hope, tempered immediately by the harder, more familiar instinct that had kept her alive through every previous moment this war had offered her false comfort. "Though I'd remind you, and myself, that a council convening an emergency session and a council actually agreeing to terms with an enemy nation are two very different outcomes, separated by an enormous amount of political maneuvering I have no ability to influence from a rear area billet. I would not spend the relief yet." She was right to withhold it. 2 days later, the same courier who'd delivered word of the council's emergency session returned with a second dispatch, considerably longer than the first, and considerably less encouraging, because while the Empire's council debated, and the Republic's command signaled tentative willingness, a faction within the Empire's own military establishment, one General Staff had not fully controlled even in ordinary circumstances, had reached a very different conclusion about what the rifts represented, and had begun, without General Staff's explicit authorization, to act on it. The dispatch was from Rudersdorf directly, and it carried none of Zetour's careful dryness. It was blunt in a way Tanya had rarely seen from him, Major, report immediately. General Kester's independent command has launched an unauthorized offensive against the Rhine Rift site. Full core strength, 3 divisions, intended as a decisive strike to eliminate the threat before council deliberations conclude. Launched 4 hours ago without general staff clearance. We do not yet have casualty figures. Your battalion is being recalled to forward position immediately, not to engage, but to observe and, if necessary, extract survivors. Move now. Tanya was on her feet and calling for Weiss before she'd finished reading the second line. The small window of hope Zetor's earlier dispatch had opened, slamming shut with the particular violent speed she'd learned, over months of this war, to expect from any good news that arrived without a caveat attached. Full core strength, she said, half to herself, running the numbers with a dread that was rapidly overtaking every other calculation. 3 divisions, tens of thousands of soldiers, committed to a single concentrated offensive against an enemy whose combat effectiveness scaled directly with the scale of violence thrown against it. If her model of this enemy was even half correct, General Kester had just handed it the single largest infusion of strength anyone had offered it since the rift first opened. They saw the smoke before they saw anything else. A vast gray column rising through the mist from what should have been open farmland, thick and roiling in a way that ordinary artillery fire didn't produce, and Tanya felt her stomach drop with the particular sick certainty of a battlefield commander recognizing, from a distance, the specific signature of a battle that had already gone catastrophically wrong. Major, Weiss's voice, tight, from her left wing. That's not artillery smoke. That's too much. I see it. She didn't slow their approach, though every rational instinct told her that flying directly toward an active engagement zone against an enemy that had already killed 9 of her people once was, by any reasonable calculation, a poor decision. But Rudersdorf's orders had been clear. Observe, extract survivors if possible. And she had learned enough about herself over months of this war to know that she was not, whatever her carefully cultivated reputation for cold pragmatism suggested, actually capable of holding position and doing nothing while soldiers died in front of her. What resolved out of the smoke as they closed the distance was not a battle. It was a graveyard, still in the process of being made. General Kester's 3 divisions had advanced in conventional formation, infantry in the lead supported by armor, mage battalions providing overhead cover, the kind of concentrated textbook assault that had served the Empire well against the Republic for years, directly into ground that Tanya's own engagement, 1 week and a lifetime of hard-won intelligence ago, had already demonstrated was catastrophically unsuited to conventional doctrine. The rift's perimeter had not held against 3 divisions. It had done something worse. It had absorbed them, drawn them in, and Tanya watched, from 400 meters and closing, as the true scale of what had emerged from that tear in the earth became visible for the first time. The rift's mouth had widened. Not dramatically, not violently, but steadily, as if the sheer volume of violence being fed into it had stretched the wound wider to accommodate more traffic, and from it now poured a density of hostiles that made her first engagement with a handful of filth and a single soldier perimeter look, in retrospect, like a probing skirmish rather than a genuine assault. Dozens of the small hunched shapes swarmed across the churned ground where Imperial infantry had tried and failed to hold a line. A cluster of the soldier-type automatons had dug into what remained of a farmhouse's stone foundation and were putting down suppressing fire with a discipline that made Imperial infantry doctrine look almost improvisational by comparison. And moving through the wreckage of the assault's forward elements, unhurried, methodical, she saw the darker, scarred bulk of the machine-type Bauman's report had first described. Not 1 now, but 3. Each one moving through the field of Imperial dead with the same terrible, curating patience. And above it all, cutting through the smoke and mist in a way that made every mage in Tanya's flight instinctively tighten formation. She saw V1 again, and understood immediately, watching it move, that whatever ground it had gained since their first engagement, 4 days ago, had not slowed. "Report to General Staff," she said, keeping her voice level through an act of will that cost her more than she'd ever admit. 3 Imperial divisions committed. Engagement ongoing. Hostile forces significantly reinforced beyond previous assessment. I am not engaging the main body. Repeat, I am not committing this battalion to a general engagement. She scanned the field, looking past the horror of it for the specific thing Rudersdorf's orders had actually tasked her with. I want eyes on any organized withdrawal or surviving unit formations. We're here to extract, not to refight this. They found the survivors on the assault's western flank, where a battered remnant of the 2nd Division's lead infantry regiment, perhaps 200 men out of what had likely been a full regiment's strength, had managed to break contact and were falling back in something that resembled order, more through desperate discipline than any coherent command structure. Their commanding officer, a Colonel Tanya didn't recognize, badly wounded and being half-carried by 2 of his own soldiers, looked up as her flight descended to provide cover, and the expression on his face was not relief. It was the flat, hollowed-out look of a man who had watched something happen that he would spend the rest of his life failing to fully explain to anyone who hadn't seen it themselves. "Major," his voice was a rasp. "General Kester, is he? I don't have information on the general's status, Colonel. I'm here on General Staff's orders to extract survivors and observe." "What happened?" The colonel's laugh had no humor in it at all. "What happened? What happened, Major, is that we advanced in good order, exactly as trained, exactly as we've advanced against the Republic 100 times, and it didn't matter. It didn't matter how many of them we killed, every man we lost, they just—" He stopped, swallowed, and Tanya saw Weiss and Serebriakov both go very still beside her, listening. "They got faster, Major, not all at once. But every hour, every wave, they hit harder and moved quicker, like the battle itself was feeding them, and General Kester kept ordering us forward, because pulling back wasn't in the plan, and by the time anyone with the authority to actually change the plan realized what was happening, we'd already lost 2/3 of the division." Tanya provided cover for the withdrawal in silence, because there was nothing to say to that account that wouldn't have sounded, in the moment, either hollow or cruel, and because every word of it confirmed the exact mechanism she'd theorized in front of Zetor and Rudersdorf a week ago, now proven at a cost measured in tens of thousands of lives, rather than the 9 deaths her own first engagement had cost. They got the survivors clear. It took the better part of 3 hours, running relay extraction flights back to the nearest secure position, while the smoke behind them thickened, and the ground-level sounds of the collapsing offensive slowly faded into something closer to a low, grinding silence. And by the time Tanya finally sat down at the rally point, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with mana expenditure, and everything to do with the accumulated weight of everything she'd just watched, she had a casualty estimate that made her ill to compose into an actual report. 2 divisions effectively destroyed, the 3rd badly mauled, in full retreat, its cohesion questionable. General Kester unaccounted for, presumed dead, and the rift itself, according to the last aerial observation before she'd broken off to focus entirely on extraction, visibly, measurably wider than it had been that morning. A wound in the world that had just been fed the largest single meal anyone had offered it since the war began, and had, by every available indication, grown stronger for it. She found a quiet corner of the rally point's makeshift medical tent, away from the worst of the wounded, and allowed herself, for exactly as long as it took to draft the report General Staff was waiting for, the particular cold grief of a soldier who had been right about something and had wanted, more than she'd let herself admit, even to Degurechaff, to be wrong. To General von Degurechaff, she wrote, the pencil steady in her hand even though nothing else about her felt steady at all. General Kester's unauthorized offensive has resulted in the confirmed loss of 2 Imperial divisions and severe degradation of a third. Preliminary assessment indicates the hostile forces' combat capability increased measurably over the course of the engagement, consistent with the casualty scaling hypothesis previously reported. The rift itself has expanded in physical size following this engagement. I want to state, without equivocation, that this outcome was the predictable result of committing overwhelming conventional force against a threat whose strength scales with exactly that kind of commitment. I do not believe this war can survive many more engagements of this scale against this enemy, on any front. I renew, with considerably greater urgency than 1 week ago, my recommendation that the Empire pursue the Republic's signaled willingness to discuss an armistice, not as a matter of honor or exhaustion, but as the single most direct action currently available to reduce the rate at which this enemy is being strengthened. Every additional day this war continues at current intensity is, I believe, measurably shortening the amount of time we have before this threat becomes unstoppable, regardless of which side of the front it emerges from. She signed it, sealed it, and handed it to the waiting courier, and then sat alone in the medical tent's quiet corner for a long moment, listening to the distant sounds of a defeat still settling into the war's collective memory, and thought, with a bitterness she rarely let herself indulge, that somewhere beyond the reach of any mana she could sense, Being X was very possibly watching all of this unfold, and she would have given a great deal, in that moment, to know whether the god found it entertaining. The Emperor's Council convened its emergency session 2 days after General Kester's offensive collapsed, and Tanya was not in the room for it. A Kampfgruppe major, however decorated, did not sit at that table, whatever her tactical relevance to the crisis under discussion, but she got the shape of it second-hand from Degurechaff. 3 days later, in a briefing that carried the particular exhausted weight of a man who had spent 72 hours arguing a position against people who outranked him and did not want to hear it. The council is divided, he said, without preamble, in the same rear area office where this had all started. There is a faction, considerably influential, that views Kester's defeat as evidence we need a larger, better coordinated conventional response, not less force but more. A continental mobilization, specifically against the rift threat, treating it as a third belligerent, to be defeated the way we'd defeat any other army. With respect, sir, that faction did not read my report, Tanya said, and heard the edge in her own voice, and did not entirely try to soften it. They read it, Major. They simply don't believe the casualty scaling mechanism applies at true continental mobilization scale. Their argument, and I want to represent it fairly even though I don't agree with it, is that Kester's force was insufficient, badly coordinated, committed piecemeal into unfamiliar terrain, and that a genuinely overwhelming force, properly supported, would win through sheer weight before the scaling effect became decisive. He rubbed at the bridge of his nose, the gesture of a man who had made this argument, badly received, more times than he wanted to count. I do not find that argument persuasive. I have said so, repeatedly, in terms increasingly undiplomatic for a general staff officer. But I am one voice, Major, and the Council has others whose voices carry more weight than mine on questions of continental strategy. And the armistice recommendation, sir? Something in Degurechaff's expression shifted, and for the first time since this briefing began, Tanya saw something that might have been, cautiously, a flicker of actual hope. That is the one piece of genuinely good news I have for you. The Republic's overture was not a bluff, Major. Their own rift, on the western sector of their line, produced an engagement disaster, comparable to Kester's within the same week. Different circumstances, same underlying catastrophe. Republic command is, I am told through channels I trust, no less frightened than we are. Preliminary terms are being drafted. Nothing formal yet, nothing either side can announce, but there is a genuine diplomatic track now, running in parallel with the Council's argument about military response, and I credit your original recommendation for opening that track before either side had lost enough men to be forced into it by pure desperation. Tanya allowed herself, briefly, the specific satisfaction of a correct call finally bearing fruit, tempered immediately by the harder recognition that a diplomatic track and an actual armistice were separated by an enormous amount of political distance she had no ability to close from where she sat. That's meaningful progress, sir. But if the Council is simultaneously planning a larger conventional mobilization against the rifts, an armistice with the Republic accomplishes considerably less than it should. We'd simply be redirecting the exact casualty-generating engagement pattern that's strengthening this enemy, from the Republic front onto the rifts themselves. I raised precisely that objection, Major, in almost exactly those words. Zetor's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. You'll be pleased, or possibly alarmed, to know that your reasoning has become something of a fixture in these debates, even among Council members who have never met you and would likely find your manner insufferable in person. I can live with being insufferable at a distance, sir, provided the reasoning is actually heard. She paused, then asked the question she'd been holding since she walked into the room. What does General Staff actually intend to do about the mobilization faction, sir? Because if they proceed regardless of the Council's internal disagreement, we are looking at another Kester, at a scale that dwarfs the first one. Zetor was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice carried a weight that told her, before the words themselves landed, that this was the actual reason she'd been summoned. There is a compromise position emerging, Major, and I want your honest tactical assessment of it before I carry it back to the Council, because if it proceeds, your battalion will almost certainly be central to it. He spread a map across the table, not the familiar Rhine sector map she'd spent weeks staring at, but a continental map, small red pins marking each confirmed or suspected rift site, 5 of them now scattered across the width of the war. The compromise is this: no further conventional mass mobilization offensive against any rift site, full stop. The mobilization faction has agreed to shelve that plan pending further intelligence, which is itself a significant concession. In exchange, General Staff authorizes small, highly specialized units, not divisions, not battalions in the conventional sense, but hand-picked, minimally sized teams operating on containment and intelligence-gathering objectives only, to study each rift site in enough depth that we can eventually develop a doctrine that doesn't simply feed the enemy more casualties every time we engage it. Small units, Tanya repeated slowly, turning the implication over. Sir, if the casualty scaling hypothesis is correct, wouldn't a small elite unit be exactly the kind of high-value target the hunting-type hostiles select for? We may be trading the risk of feeding the enemy in bulk for the risk of feeding it exactly what it wants most. That is the exact objection 3 separate council members raised, Major, and I don't have a clean answer to it, beyond the observation that the alternative, either doing nothing while 5 rifts continue to widen, or repeating Kester's mistake at 10 times the scale, carries risks I consider strictly worse. We need intelligence we do not currently have. We need to understand whether these rifts can be closed, whether their expansion can be halted independent of casualties fed into them, whether there is some vulnerability in the hostiles' own logistics we haven't yet identified. A small, careful team, operating with full knowledge of everything you've already learned at cost is, I believe, our least bad option currently on the table. Tanya looked at the map, at the 5 red pins scattered across a continent already exhausted by years of total war, and felt the particular cold clarity of a decision she didn't want to make, settling over her regardless. "You're asking me to volunteer my battalion for this, sir. I'm asking you to consider it, Major. I will not order it. The risk profile is too uncertain for me to comfortably compel volunteers into it, and I suspect, given everything I've read in your reports over the past 2 weeks, that ordering you would in any case be unnecessary." Something in his expression, briefly, softened into something closer to genuine regard than the professional formality he usually extended her. "You have more direct engagement experience against this threat than any officer in the Imperial military. You identified the casualty scaling mechanism before General Staff had any other source confirming it. And you have, I think, a clearer understanding than almost anyone currently serving of exactly what is actually at stake here. Not simply the war against the Republic, not simply this front, but the question of whether this continent survives what's been let loose on it at all." Tanya was quiet for a long moment, running the calculation the way she ran every calculation that actually mattered, not the easy arithmetic of tactical advantage, but the harder, more honest reckoning of what she actually owed to a war she'd never asked to be dropped into, fought for a nation whose survival she'd optimized for, out of pragmatism rather than any deeper loyalty, against an enemy that threatened not just the Empire, but every living thing on the continent regardless of which uniform they wore. She thought of Serebriakov's question in the study, "Did we cause this?" And of her own answer, that blame mattered less than what came next. She thought of the Colonel's flat, hollowed voice describing Kester's collapse, of 9 names on a casualty list from her first engagement, of the Volkmann brothers Bauman's report had described dying for a salvage operation that had stumbled into something none of them understood. She thought, finally, of the particular arithmetic she'd built her entire survival strategy on since the day she'd woken up in this world, that a rational actor did what maximized the probability of continued existence, and that sometimes, uncomfortably, the action that best served that goal was not the safest one available, but the one that actually addressed the threat rather than merely postponing the reckoning with it. "I'll volunteer the battalion, sir," she said finally, "on the condition that I have full authority over team composition, full access to every fragment of intelligence General Staff has gathered on all 5 rift sites, and explicit authorization to withdraw from any engagement the moment the casualty scaling risk outweighs the intelligence value. No political pressure to hold position for optics. No General Kester repeating himself with my people instead of his. Granted, Major, on all 3 points. You have my word, and I will make certain it's in writing before your team deploys." Zetor extended a hand, and Tanya shook it, and felt, in the gesture, the specific weight of a commitment that was going to define the next phase of her war, whether or not she'd fully reckoned yet with everything it was going to cost her to see it through. Outside the office, the rain had finally stopped, and for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, a thin, grudging strip of actual sunlight broke through the cloud cover over the Rhine. Not warmth, not really, but light, and Tanya stood in it for a moment before returning to her battalion, and allowed herself the small, private thought that whatever came next, she intended to survive it, and she intended, insofar as it lay within her power, to make certain the people she led survived it with her. Building the team took 4 days, and Tanya spent every one of them running calculations she'd never had to run before. Not tactical calculations, not the familiar arithmetic of formulas and mana reserves and engagement angles, but the considerably harder arithmetic of who to ask to volunteer for a mission she genuinely could not promise them would end in anything but death. She kept the core of the 2/3, Weiss, whose steadiness under fire had proven itself a dozen times over, Serebriakov, whose sharpness had grown into something she now genuinely relied on rather than merely tolerated, Grants, healed enough from his wound to insist, with a stubbornness that surprised her, that he wasn't being left behind for something this important. She added a handful of specialists General Staff's intelligence office had identified, a mage with particular expertise in ward and containment formulas, on the theory that if the rifts could be sealed rather than simply fought, someone with the relevant skill needed to be present to attempt it. A combat engineer with experience in structural demolition, in case the rift's physical geometry proved vulnerable to something other than direct assault, and, at Zetur's specific insistence, a small liaison element from military intelligence whose sole job was documentation, recording everything, exhaustively, so that whatever the team learned would survive even if the team itself did not. She did not, this time, request additional battalions. That was, she recognized, the entire point of the compromise Zetur had negotiated. Small, careful, minimally sized, a team built to gather intelligence rather than to win a battle, because winning the battle had already been tried, at enormous cost, and had made everything worse. The plan, when they finally deployed, was deliberately modest by the standards of everything Tanya had organized in this war. No frontal engagement, no attempt to destroy the primary hostiles. A careful, staged approach to the Rhine Rift's outer perimeter, chosen over the 4 other sites because it was the one Tanya had the most direct experience with the explicit objective of observing the rift's physical structure at close range, testing whether the containment mage's ward formulas had any measurable effect on its boundary, and withdrawing the instant the risk calculus shifted against them. They approached at dusk, on the theory that the low light that had favored the Empire in the first engagement might still hold some advantage, moving in a loose, irregular formation, designed to avoid the kind of predictable pattern V1 had demonstrated it could read and exploit. The rift, when they finally had eyes on it from a cautious 400 meters, had changed since Tanya had last seen it up close. Wider, as the reports had indicated, its red glow deeper and somehow more textured. No longer the smooth pulse of their first encounter, but something with visible internal movement, as if whatever lay beyond it had thickened, grown denser, more present. The perimeter around it had changed too, not the loose scattering of soldiers and filth from the earliest days, but something that looked, disturbingly, like actual fortification. Wreckage from Kester's failed offensive incorporated into makeshift barriers, as if the hostiles had learned not just combat tactics, but the basic logic of defensive engineering from the corpse of a defeated Imperial Corps. Major, the containment specialist, a quiet, precise mage named Hoffman who Tanya had selected specifically for his reputation as someone who did not exaggerate his own capabilities, kept his field glasses steady, despite what she could see was a carefully controlled unease. I can attempt a ward reading from this distance, but I'll need to close to within perhaps 100 meters to actually test whether containment formulas have any effect on the boundary itself. That's well inside engagement range for the perimeter defenses. Tanya weighed it, running the calculation with the same careful discipline that had kept her alive through everything the war had thrown at her so far. 100 meters was not survivable if the primary hostile noticed them and chose to engage directly. She knew that from bitter experience. But the entire mission's value depended on exactly the kind of data Hoffman couldn't gather from a safe distance, and a mission that returned with nothing but confirmation of things they already knew would have cost whatever it cost without buying anything in return. "We go in staged," she said finally. Hoffman, Weiss, and I, close to the working distance. Everyone else holds at 400 meters with explicit orders to extract the moment anything goes wrong. No heroics, no attempted rescue that risks the whole team. Serebriakov, you have tactical command of the holding element if I'm not in a position to give orders directly. Serebriakov's expression flickered. The old instinct to argue that she should be in the forward element rather than holding back. An instinct Tanya recognized because she'd fought it in herself more than once over the months they'd served together. But her adjutant had grown enough, in the time since this crisis began, to swallow the argument and nod instead. Understood, Major. We'll be ready. The approach to 100 meters took 20 careful minutes, low and slow across ground, still scarred from Kester's collapsed offensive, past the half-buried wreckage of Imperial armor and the particular, terrible stillness of a battlefield that had been picked clean of anything the hostiles considered useful. Tanya kept her orb spooled at minimum readiness, enough to react instantly without broadcasting a mana signature large enough to draw immediate attention, and beside her, Weiss moved with the flat, focused economy of a soldier who had stopped, weeks ago, needing to be told what caution looked like in this specific war. Hoffman began his ward reading the moment they reached position, murmuring the low, precise cadence of a containment formula's diagnostic phase, and for nearly 90 seconds, long enough that Tanya's carefully controlled patience began, despite everything, to fray at the edges. Nothing happened except the slow, careful gathering of data neither she nor Hoffman yet had the expertise to interpret in real time. Then Hoffman went very still and said, in a voice that had lost most of its careful precision, "Major, I'm reading something. The boundary. It's not stable in the way I expected. There's a resonance pattern, very faint, but it's there, and it's—" He paused, adjusting something in his formula's structure with the quick, focused motion of a specialist who had just found the exact thread he'd been hoping to find. "Major, I believe the boundary is at least partially anchored to something physical on this side, not purely dimensional. If I'm reading this correctly, there may be a structural weak point we could actually target." It was, Tanya recognized immediately, the single most valuable piece of intelligence the entire crisis had produced since the first report of the rift's existence, the first genuine indication that this was not simply an unstoppable, permanent wound in the world, but something with an actual physical vulnerability, however faint, however uncertain. It was also, she understood in the same instant, the kind of discovery that made continuing to stand at 100 meters, mana signature slowly building as Hoffman pushed his formula deeper into the resonance pattern, an increasingly dangerous proposition. The ground trembled, and this time it was not the distant, patient vibration she'd felt on her very first reconnaissance flight 2 weeks earlier. It was close, it was directional, and when she looked up from Hoffman's working formula toward the rift's widened mouth, she saw for the first time since this had all begun, the thing that had been moving beneath the surface since the very first day. Vast, grinding, iron-plated, cresting up out of the earth like a fortress deciding, after 2 weeks of patient burial, that it had finally finished waiting. The earth mover had arrived. For a long moment, no one moved. Even Hoffman's formula seemed to hang suspended in the space between one syllable and the next. And Tanya stood at 100 meters with her orb half-spooled, and every calculation she'd built over 2 weeks of hard-won intelligence, simply stalling out, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what had just crested into view. It was not shaped like the other machines, where V1 and the soldiers and even the scarred, curating hunter type carried something recognizably close to a human silhouette, however wrong in its details. The thing now rising from the rift's widened mouth belonged to a different category of existence entirely, a vast, segmented mass of blackened iron and grinding treads, easily the size of the farmhouse that had served as her first command post, its surface scored and pitted with the accumulated wear of something that had ground forward through far more than 2 weeks of this war. Along its flanks, half glimpsed in the fading dusk light, ran seams that pulsed with the same wet arterial red as the rift itself, as if the thing were not merely a machine but a vessel, still connected by some umbilical logic to whatever lay on the other side of the tear it had just fully emerged from. "Major," Weiss's voice, very quiet, very controlled, the particular flatness of a soldier holding himself together through sheer discipline in the face of something his training had never prepared him for. "Orders!" Tanya did not answer immediately, because the honest answer, "I don't know. I have never seen anything like this." My entire threat model just became obsolete in the space of 4 seconds, was not a sentence a commanding officer said aloud to the people depending on her to have already solved the problem. She ran the calculation instead, fast, brutal, stripped down to the only variables that actually mattered in the next 10 seconds. Distance, exposure. The mana signature Hoffman's formula had already been building for 90 seconds, and the grinding, ground-shaking pace at which the vast machine was beginning, with terrible, unhurried patience, to move. "Hoffman, can you complete the reading and disengage in under 30 seconds? Yes, Major. I have enough data for the structural weak point. I just need to properly anchor the... You have 15. Weiss. Prep a covering formula. Wide radius. Ready to throw the moment Hoffman breaks contact. We are not engaging that thing directly. We are extracting." She keyed the field signal to the holding element without waiting for confirmation from either man, her voice pitched for exactly the calm, procedural clarity that panic could not afford to interrupt. "Degurechaff. Full extraction protocol. Forward element withdrawing now. Converge at the rally point. Do not advance toward our position under any circumstances." The vast machine's treads ground against churned earth, and Tanya felt the vibration of it through the soles of her boots even at 100 meters, a sound less like footsteps and more like a landslide deciding, with terrible deliberation, which direction to fall. It had not yet oriented toward them directly. Whatever passed for its attention seemed, for the moment, occupied by the sheer mechanical process of fully clearing the rift's widened mouth. But she had learned, over 2 engagements and countless hours of grim intelligence review, not to mistake a hostile's current inattention for safety. Hoffman finished his reading with 3 seconds to spare, breaking the formula's anchor with the quick, controlled snap of a specialist who had trained for exactly this kind of forced disengagement, and the moment his voice confirmed it. "Data secured, Major. We can move." Tanya was already turning, already calling the retreat, already running the numbers on how many of the next 60 seconds they actually had, before that vast, grinding presence noticed 3 mana signatures withdrawing across open ground. They didn't get all 60. At perhaps the 30-second mark, with the rally point's tree line just becoming visible through the deepening dusk, Tanya felt the ground-shaking rhythm behind them change register. No longer the steady, deliberate pace of a machine clearing its own emergence point, but something sharper, more directed, a shift in cadence that her instincts read, with cold certainty, as notice. "It's turned toward us," she called, not breaking stride, mana already spooling for the burst of speed that would close the remaining distance to the tree line faster than any sustained formula could manage. Full speed. Do not look back. Do not slow down for any reason. The tree line swallowed them with perhaps 20 meters of margin to spare, and Tanya did not permit herself to fully believe they'd made it clean until she'd counted every member of the forward element present and breathing. Hoffman, pale and shaking with adrenaline but upright. Weiss, already turning to cover their retreat with a formula he didn't end up needing to throw. And even then, the relief was tempered, immediately, by the sound still audible behind them, the vast machine's grinding advance, slower than a mage's flight, considerably slower, but not stopping, continuing forward with the patient, implacable certainty of something that had never once needed speed to eventually arrive wherever it intended to go. They regrouped at the rally point an hour later, full team accounted for, no casualties. The first engagement against this front, Tanya reflected grimly, that had cost them nothing at all, which felt less like good fortune and more like a debt the war would eventually collect with interest. Hoffman's data sat spread across the command table, and the intelligence officer assigned to document the mission was already transcribing it with the careful, Exhaustive precision Zetur had specifically requested, because if the team didn't survive to report this in person, the data needed to survive regardless. "Walk me through it," Tanya said, once Hoffman had steadied enough to speak clearly, in terms General Staff can actually act on. "The rift's boundary isn't purely dimensional, Major. There's a resonance anchor, something physical, that I believe corresponds to whatever originally tore the boundary open at each site. If my reading is correct, and I want to stress the sample size here is exactly one attempt at exactly one site, disrupting that anchor point directly, rather than simply fighting whatever comes through it, might actually close the rift rather than merely holding it at a standoff." He hesitated, and Tanya heard the caveat coming before he said it. "The difficulty, Major, is that I don't yet know where the anchor point actually is. The resonance I read suggests it's associated with the original mana testing apparatus that opened this specific rift, buried likely, somewhere beneath the site, possibly beneath that." He didn't need to gesture toward what that meant. Everyone at the table had felt the ground shake beneath the vast machine's advance an hour earlier. If the anchor is physically located near or beneath what we're now calling the primary structure, reaching it safely becomes considerably more difficult than the reading itself was. Tanya absorbed that, running it against every piece of intelligence the crisis had produced so far, and felt the shape of an actual strategy beginning, for the first time in 2 weeks, to assemble itself out of what had until now been nothing but reactive crisis management. We are no longer simply trying to survive an unstoppable enemy. We may be looking at a genuine path to actually ending this, site by site, if we can develop a method to reach and disrupt each anchor without repeating Kester's mistake of feeding the enemy exactly the casualties it wants in the process. "That's a significant if, Major," Weiss said quietly, and she didn't disagree with him, because it was, and because the alternative, pretending the difficulty away rather than confronting it honestly, was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten 2 Imperial divisions destroyed in a single afternoon. It was here, staring at Hoffman's data and the shape of a genuine strategic option, finally beginning to emerge from 2 weeks of grinding, reactive horror, that Tanya found herself confronting the ethical weight of the decision actually in front of her, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the calculation was not as clean as she'd have preferred. Reaching the anchor point beneath the vast machine's emergence site would require, by any honest assessment, either an extraordinarily precise small team infiltration, which risked everything on a handful of specialists succeeding against odds neither Hoffman nor anyone else could currently quantify, or a deliberate diversionary engagement, drawing the primary hostiles' attention elsewhere, while a second team attempted the actual objective. And a diversionary engagement by its very nature meant deliberately committing soldiers to draw fire from an enemy whose combat effectiveness scaled directly with the casualties inflicted on them. It meant, stripped of every euphemism the language of military planning offered to soften it, deliberately spending lives as bait, calculated and cold, in exactly the transactional logic Tanya had built her entire survival philosophy on since the day she'd woken up in this world, and doing it, this time, with full and complete knowledge of exactly what the cost would mean, not just to the soldiers who volunteered, but to the enemy those soldiers' deaths would make measurably, tangibly stronger in the process. She sat with that calculation for a long moment, in the quiet of the Rally Point's command tent, and did not reach for an easy answer, because there wasn't one. Every path forward cost something. Doing nothing meant 5 rifts continuing to widen indefinitely while the war ground on and strengthened them regardless. Attempting the anchor without a diversion meant an infiltration team facing the primary hostiles with no support, likely fatally. Attempting it with a diversion meant knowingly, deliberately feeding the enemy the exact resource it needed most, in the hope of buying enough of a window to end the threat entirely. "Major," Serebryakov's voice, quiet, from across the table, and Tanya looked up to find her adjutant watching her with an expression that suggested she'd followed the same grim arithmetic to the same uncomfortable place. Whatever you decide, I want to be part of it. Whichever team. I'm not saying that to be noble, Major. I'm saying it because I trust your judgment more than I trust anyone else's in this army, and if this is the operation that actually ends it, I want to be there when it happens. Tanya looked at her adjutant, and at Weiss, and at Hoffman's careful, hard-won data spread across the table, and felt, beneath the cold calculation she'd spent months cultivating as her primary defense against a war that had never once asked her permission to exist, something that was not purely rational at all, a specific, reluctant weight of responsibility toward the people who had chosen, again and again, to follow her into exactly this kind of impossible math, and a recognition, however uncomfortable, that whatever decision she made next would cost someone something, and that the honest thing to do was to make that cost as small and as informed as she possibly could, rather than pretend the choice in front of her was clean. No one is committing to anything tonight, she said finally. I want a full night's rest, and I want Hoffman's data cross-referenced against everything General Staff has on the other 4 rift sites before anyone decides on an operational plan. This is not a decision I intend to make on adrenaline and 2 weeks of exhaustion. She looked around the table, at faces that had followed her through the worst 2 weeks any of them had ever fought through, and allowed herself, for once, to say the thing plainly rather than dress it in tactical language. If we do this, it will cost lives, deliberately, in a way none of the fighting so far has required us to fully own in advance. I will not ask anyone to volunteer for that without being certain, myself, that it's the right call, and I am not yet certain. Get some rest. We'll revisit this at first light, with clearer heads and better information than we currently have. Outside the tent, full dark had settled over the Rhine, and somewhere beyond the tree line, the vast machine's grinding advance had finally slowed and then stopped, resettling into the patient stillness that had characterized this entire crisis since its very first hour. An enemy that had never once needed to hurry, content, it seemed, to simply wait, certain that time itself was the one resource it could always count on the war to keep supplying. Morning brought clearer heads, as Tanya had hoped, but it did not bring an easy answer, and by the time the full team reassembled around the command table at first light, she had already arrived at the decision she suspected. Deep down, she'd actually made the previous night, even if she'd needed the intervening hours to be certain it was reasoned, rather than merely exhausted. We're not running a diversionary engagement, she said, without preamble, watching the room absorb it. I considered it through most of the night, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion. Deliberately feeding this enemy a sacrificial force, even a small one, even for the sake of ending the entire threat, is exactly the kind of transaction that got 2 divisions killed under Kester, and that I refuse to authorize with full knowledge of what it costs. If Hoffman's data is right, and the anchor point is physical and reachable, then we reach it through precision and information, not through spending lives as a distraction. That's not going to be easy, Major, Hoffman said, though something in his voice suggested relief rather than argument. Without a diversion, we're approaching the anchor point with the primary hostiles at full attention, potentially including the vast machine itself. Then we don't approach where they're looking. Tanya spread a hand-drawn sketch of the rift site across the table. She'd spent 2 hours of the night, unable to sleep regardless of her own advice to the team, reconstructing the site's geography from memory and every reconnaissance photograph General Staff had gathered over 2 weeks. Hoffman's reading traced the anchor's resonance to the original testing apparatus, which means it's tied to a specific physical location, not randomly buried, but situated wherever the Imperial testing site's equipment actually stood before the rift opened. I want engineering records, If this was an active Imperial research installation before it became a catastrophe, someone kept site surveys, equipment placement logs, something that tells us exactly where to dig, rather than forcing us to search blind under fire. It took the better part of a day to run down the records. Zetor's office, once briefed on the theory, moved with an urgency that cut through weeks of ordinary bureaucratic friction, and by evening, a courier arrived with exactly what Tanya had hoped for: pre-catastrophe engineering surveys of the testing site, complete with equipment placement diagrams that, cross-referenced against Hoffman's resonance data, narrowed the anchor point's likely location to a collapsed sub-level bunker, roughly 60 meters north-northeast of the rift's current mouth, inside the vast machine's territory, but not, crucially, directly beneath it. "There's a path," Tanya said, tracing it on the map with a steady finger, "along the old testing site's access tunnel, here, that a small team could potentially use to approach the anchor point from underground, rather than across open ground where every hostile on the surface would see us coming. It's not without risk. The tunnel network hasn't been surveyed since before the rift opened. We don't know its current condition, but it's the only approach vector I can identify that doesn't require walking directly past either the primary hostile or the vast machine." The plan that emerged over the following 2 days was, by the standards of everything Tanya had organized in this war, almost absurdly modest. A 4-person infiltration team, Tanya, Weiss, Hoffman, and a combat engineer named Corporal Steiner, whose expertise in structural work made him essential for navigating and, if necessary, clearing a 2-week collapsed tunnel network, moving underground while the rest of the team held position at the rally point, ready to extract but explicitly ordered not to engage unless the infiltration team was directly compromised. It was, Tanya reflected, turning the final plan over one last time the night before they moved. The first operation of this entire crisis built around precision and restraint, rather than overwhelming force. And something in that fact felt, however uncertain the outcome remained, like the correct shape for finally meeting this threat, on terms that didn't simply hand it more of exactly what it wanted. The tunnel network, when they finally descended into it at dusk 2 days later, was worse than Steiner's cautious estimate had suggested. Half collapsed in 3 separate sections, flooded ankle-deep in places with groundwater that had found its way in through cracks the original engineers had never accounted for, and thick with a stale, mineral cold that made every breath feel like it cost something. Tanya led with her orb at minimum glow, enough to see by without broadcasting a signature any distance through solid earth, and behind her, Steiner worked with quiet, methodical focus at each blockage, clearing just enough passage for the 4 of them to squeeze through without triggering a further collapse. They found evidence of the original catastrophe 40 minutes in, a section of tunnel where the walls themselves seemed to have been warped rather than merely collapsed, the stone twisted in ways that made Tanya's skin crawl to look at directly, and Hoffman, pausing to take a reading, went very pale and very quiet before reporting, in a voice that had lost most of its professional steadiness, that they were close. "The resonance is strong here, Major. Very strong. I believe the anchor point is directly ahead, maybe 30 meters. The tunnel opened, 30 meters on, into what had clearly once been the testing site's primary sub-level chamber, a broad, vaulted space that the original catastrophe had left half intact, banks of ruined Imperial testing apparatus still lining one wall, their orb arrays dark and shattered, and at the chamber's center, embedded in the floor itself like a wound that had scarred over, rather than healed, a knot of the same wet, pulsing red light that marked the rift's surface mouth, considerably smaller here, contained, but unmistakably connected. "That's it," Hoffman breathed. "Major, that's the anchor. If I can get a containment formula directly onto it." He didn't finish the sentence, because the chamber's far wall which Tanya had assumed collapsed and impassable, shifted, and from the darkness beyond it, unhurried, its lens finding her instantly across 30 meters of ruined stone with the same uncanny certainty as their very first encounter 3 weeks ago. V1 stepped into the chamber. It had been waiting. Whether it had sensed Hoffman's earlier resonance reading from the surface, or whether some deeper logic had simply positioned it here as a final guardian regardless of whether intruders ever came, Tanya didn't know and didn't have time to determine, because the revolver was already rising, and she had, at absolute best, perhaps 2 seconds to decide what came next. "Hoffman, the anchor, now," she called, already moving, already throwing herself between V1's line of sight and the chamber's center, where Hoffman had frozen for one fatal half-second. "Weiss Steiner, cover him, I'll hold it," she had told herself, weeks ago, standing in a farmhouse study staring at a ceiling stain, that she did not know if this fight was one she could win. She still didn't know, but she threw herself into it anyway, orb blazing to full output in the confined space of the chamber, because the alternative, Hoffman dying before he completed the one formula that might actually end this, was not a cost she was willing to let the war extract, not after everything it had already taken. And for the first time since this entire catastrophe began, Major Tanya von Degurechaff found herself fighting not for tactical advantage, not for survival calculated in cold percentages, but for something that felt, uncomfortably, disorientingly, much closer to simply refusing to let this particular death happen in front of her. The chamber was too small for the kind of fight Tanya had learned to use against V1 in open air. No room for the wide, weaving evasion patterns that had kept her alive 3 weeks ago. No altitude to trade for distance. And she understood, in the half-second before the revolver fired, that this fight was going to be decided by something closer to raw endurance than clever tactics. The first shot caught her across the outer edge of her shoulder, a graze that burned like a brand and spun her half a step sideways, and she did not let it stop her forward momentum, closing the gap rather than opening it, because a marksman's advantage collapsed at melee range, in a way it never did at 400 meters, and melee range was the only range this chamber actually offered. "Hoffman," she called again, not looking back, trusting Weiss and Steiner to do exactly what she'd ordered. "How long?" 40 seconds, Major, maybe less. The anchor's resisting the formula. I need to push through it. 40 seconds. She did the arithmetic in the cold, fast part of her mind that never stopped running even mid-combat. 40 seconds against something that had put down 3 mages with 3 shots in their very first engagement, in a space too confined for her to outmaneuver it. She did not like the odds. She engaged anyway, because there was no version of this chamber where she got to like the odds, and closed the final distance with a burst of mana-fed speed that put her inside the revolver's ideal engagement range before V1 could fully track the change. It adjusted almost instantly. She felt the weapon's barrel swing to track her at closer range, faster than should have been possible in the confined space. But at melee distance, she had something the open field engagement had never given her: the ability to grab the weapon's arm directly, mana-reinforced strength meeting gunmetal and iron, in a contest that she was not at all certain she could win, and did not have the luxury of losing. The second shot fired wide, the round sparking off the chamber's stone ceiling, and Tanya felt V1's other hand close around her collar with a grip that hit like a closing vice, lifting her half off the ground with a strength that made her mana-reinforced hold on its weapon arm feel suddenly, terrifyingly inadequate. "Major," Weiss's voice, and she heard him moving to help, and had just enough breath left to gasp out the order that mattered more than her own immediate survival. "Stay with Hoffman. That's an order." She twisted in V1's grip, throwing everything her orb had left into a point-blank explosion formula, aimed not at the machine's chest. She'd tried that before, weeks ago, and knew by now how quickly it adapted to repeated damage in the same location. but at the joint of the arm holding her collar, the specific articulated seam where gunmetal met whatever passed for tendon in its construction. The blast tore the grip loose, throwing her clear across the chamber floor in a tumble that cost her most of what remained of her mana reserve, and left her sprawled, gasping, against the base of one of the ruined testing apparatus racks. V1 turned toward her, unhurried even with damage visibly sparking from the ruined joint, and Tanya, flat on her back with her orb reserves critically low and no clear path to disengage, understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that she had perhaps 5 seconds left before this became something she did not survive. "Got it," Hoffman's voice, cracking with strain and something that might have been triumph, cut across the chamber. "Major, the formula's taken hold. I need everyone clear, now." The anchor point's pulsing red light, which had sat steady and contained at the chamber's center through the entire fight, flared suddenly bright, then began, with a low groaning sound that seemed to come from the stone itself, to contract, not violently, not explosively, but with the specific, terrible finality of a wound, finally, actually beginning to close. V1 stopped, for the first time since Tanya had encountered it, 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. It stopped moving entirely, its lens fixed not on her but on the shrinking light at the chamber's center, and in that stillness, Tanya saw something she had genuinely not expected to see from a thing built from gunmetal, and a coin-shaped absence where a heart should be, something that, if she'd seen it on a human face, she would have called realization. It did not try to stop Hoffman. It did not, in the final seconds before the anchor collapsed fully in on itself, do anything at all except stand very still, watching the light of whatever connection it had, to wherever it had come from finally, irrevocably sever, and then, as the chamber's red glow guttered out entirely, and the low groan of the closing anchor faded into ordinary silence, V1 simply stopped. Not destroyed, not defeated in any way Tanya's exhausted mind could immediately categorize. Simply still, gunmetal plating gone dark and inert, standing in the middle of a chamber that had just closed the door it had walked through weeks earlier. Cut off, she understood slowly, from whatever source had let it move, adapt and heal in the first place. Above them, faintly, through 30 meters of stone and collapsed tunnel, she thought she heard something that might have been the vast machine's grinding advance falling suddenly, permanently silent. They surfaced 2 hours later, exhausted, wounded, and carrying intelligence that would reshape the entire war's response to the 4 remaining rift sites, and found the rally point's holding element waiting, with the particular anxious stillness of soldiers who had spent 2 hours listening to silence and not knowing what it meant. Serebryakov reached her first, checking the wound at her shoulder with hands that shook slightly despite her best effort at professional composure, and Tanya let her adjutant fuss over the injury for exactly as long as it took to confirm it wasn't serious, before gently insisting on standing on her own. "It's closed," Tanya said, to the assembled team, and heard her own voice come out rougher than she intended, worn down by everything the day had cost. The Rhine Rift. Hoffman's formula reached the anchor point before the primary hostile could stop it. The rift is closed, and every hostile connected to it has gone inert. The silence that met the announcement was not triumphant. It was the flatter, heavier silence of people who had spent 3 weeks learning, at brutal cost, not to trust good news until it had survived contact with the war's habit of taking things back. And Tanya, watching that caution on every face around her, found she couldn't fault it, because she felt it too. 4 more sites, Weiss said quietly, voicing the thought Tanya suspected everyone was already having. "Major, this worked. Does it work everywhere?" "I don't know," Tanya admitted, and meant it, because false certainty had never once served her well in this war, and she wasn't going to start offering it now, at the exact moment it would matter most. "But we now have a method. We have Hoffman's data. We have a proof of concept, and we have 4 remaining rift sites that no longer have to be approached with nothing but grim intuition and General Kester's example of exactly what not to do. That is considerably more than we had this morning. She looked around at her team, battered, exhausted, alive, every one of them, which felt, after everything the past 3 weeks had cost, like the single most important fact in the entire report she was about to have to write. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we start figuring out how to do this 4 more times. The war did not end that night, and it did not end quickly. The 4 remaining rifts took the better part of 2 more months to close, each one costing its own specialized team its own share of blood and nerve, each one built on the hard, unglamorous foundation of intelligence rather than force, a doctrine Tanya's chamber floor gamble had proven possible, and that General Staff, chastened by Kester's example, no longer had the appetite to abandon in favor of easier, bloodier certainties. The armistice with the Republic held longer than anyone had expected, not from any newfound goodwill between 2 exhausted nations, but from the specific, shared memory of a threat that had cared nothing for either side's uniform, and the quiet, mutual understanding that some wars were not worth winning if winning meant feeding something worse. The Federation and Commonwealth theaters, watching the Rhine's example, found their own uneasy accommodations in time, imperfect and grudging, but real. Tanya never received a satisfying answer to the question that had haunted her since Degurechaff first asked it in a rear area study, whether the war itself had summoned what came through those rifts, or whether it was simply the universe's indifferent arithmetic, violence calling to violence across whatever thin membrane separated one reality from another. She suspected, in the end, that the distinction mattered less than what the continent did with the answer it had actually been given. That total war, prosecuted without limit, was not merely costly. It was, in ways no general staff briefing had ever considered before this, dangerous to the very fabric of the world fighting it. She kept the small, inert fragment of gunmetal plating Steiner had recovered from the chamber floor, sealed in a case in her quarters, a reminder she never fully explained to anyone who asked. Not a trophy, not exactly, but a marker of the exact moment a war built on cold calculation had finally, briefly, been forced to calculate something other than victory. The rain, when it came again to the Rhine that autumn, fell on trenches that were, for the first time in years, quiet.